judgment of the tribunal. A few preliminaries. The full judgment, about 300 pages, is not ready today.
Әтігерлікіңла қайырлық болсын. Мен бүгінгі қарарыны оқимын. Толық қарары 300 бәт, ama бүгінгі 60 бәтінің асаслық məzmununu sözləb çıxma. Толық höcətni yazmasını görüp çıqalaysızlar. Hazır biz faqatla bütün faktlarga, yani qolumuzdagi bar faktlar bilan chiqargan qarorimizni e'lon qilmoqchi. Yani bu qarorda guvohlik bergan kishilarning ismlari bu qarorda yozilmadi, lekin to'g'ri batdan buni ko'ra olasizlar.
The tribunal was tasked with considering whether crimes have been committed against Uyghurs, Kazakhs and other Turkish.
Bu sud mahkamasininki asosliq shu Uyg'ur, Qozoq va boshqa asonliq turk millatlarga qarshi jinoyat sodir qilmaganligini tekshirish vazifasini ustiga olgan. Bütün şu Uyghur sudiga xizmat qilgan kishilarninki ismlari va hammasi eng oxirgi raportda e'lon qilindi. Bugün 7 kişi qatnaşdı. Yani 2 kişininki bugün kelaməsliki doğrusunda səbəbini düşündürüyordu. Professor Lynch.
Finally, first of all, when you're using these microphones, it always sounds terribly loud. And then sometimes somebody tells you afterwards, I couldn't hear a word you were saying at the back. Well, there's absolutely no point in my speaking if you can't hear it. So if I'm for some reason too near or too far.
Mikrofon to'g'riliq bir qancha tushunchalarni tushuntiryapti, ya'ni mikrofon qo'llanish to'g'risida. 60 minut ichida men butun demoqchi bo'lgan gaplarimning hammasini sizlarga tushuntirishni orzu qilaman. Balkim oraliqda dam olishimiz mumkin agarda shu ehtiyojimiz bo'lsa. Yani mening bu so'zlaydiganlarim bütün hujjatninki umumiy xulosa sud ko'lgasi hukumat xalqaro bugungi Uyg'ur, Qozoq, boshqa asonliq turk millatlarga yani sodir qilgan jinoyatlari to'g'risida buni ustiga olgan. Bunu da xalqarалық qonunlarga qarshi qandaq jinoyatlarni o'tkazganligini ustiga olgan. Yani bu qonun bir hukumatninki majburiyati bilan yoki shaxsning bu o'xshamaydi, ikkiga bo'lindi. Bu qonun asosliq bizning yo'langanimiz xalqarалық qonunlari, yani irqiy qirg'inchilik qonuni, insoniyatga qarshi qonuni va qiynash qonuni degandek xalqarалық qonun.
expanded. Well, it's not this tribunal's expanded.
Yani bəzi advokatlarınki fikirdə cinayətlər və bu bulubmu irqi qırğınçılıq münasibətlik qanunlar eniq emas yoki dövlət məsuliyyətlilərinin məsulli şəxs məsuliyyətini üstüge iliş bilan oxşamaydı yoki bu qanunun dairəsini kengaytiş yoki qısqartış degəndək. Amma bu sud bu cəhətlərdə ondaq bir o'ylashmadi va faqat o'sha qonunga orqali qonun bo'yicha
Whenever genocide is
eng
considered,
oxirgi hukmni qilishga tirishdi.
it does need reading. The contracting parties, that's the states concerned, confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish.
Yani irqiy qirg'inchilikninki yoki urush vaqtida elib berilganligi yoki tinish vaqtda elib berilganligi olgan xalqaroliq qonun bo'yicha jinoyat qilmish ekanligini isbotlaydi.
To prevent and the corresponding duty to act under the convention arise at the instant that the state learns of or should normally have learned of the existence of a serious
Yani bu dövlətlər bir hökumətninki başqa bir millətlərə yoki qrupqa ötküzgən irqi qırğınçılığını bilgəndən keyin dövlətlərninki muşu ehtinamıga qol qoyğan dövlətlərning məcburiyyəti var. Yəni bunu toxtutish məcburiyyəti.
That disinclination to follow the convention on learning of the allegations against the PRC may have led to the very many reports and opinions, some of which I'll refer, that have been made and published in relation to these matters. And indeed, that disinclination to act may have led to the creation of this tribunal. What the tribunal has done is to assess evidence, to decide whether
Hamda bu Uyghur sotininki asaslıq məqsədi Xitay hökumətininki Uyğurlarga və başqa müsəlmanlarga ötküzgən qırğınçılıq ötküzdümü qanun boyunca, yəni qırğınçılıq, irqi qırğınçılıq qanun boyunca.
has sometimes done so in full view on the streets, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes in hospitals, sometimes
Yani
in
bu
centers, and sometimes in people's own homes.
yani
These
bu
allegations have not been dealt with
eyibləşlər özü, yəni hökumət özününki
allegations of national or international
ötküzgən bütün cinayətləri, yəni insanların öylərdə, türmələrdə, koçularda.
providing either the evidence or reasoning for its doing so. And so this People's Tribunal, like others before it, responsive to a request made, was willing to assess the allegations. And it has done so simply because the allegations have been left unresolved and because these are duties falling on governments.
Yəni bu irqi qırğınçılıqni əsli tekşürüş hökumətlərinki xalqara sotlarınki vəzifəsi. Amma bu vəzifəni üstüge aldığan heç kim çıxmağaşqa Uyğur sotu bu üstüge aldı.
Any artificial body or court, domestic or international, determined or sought to determine these issues, the tribunal would have been unnecessary.
Əgər də hökumətlər bunu üstüge alğan bolsa, yəni hökumətlər sotu yoki xalqara sotu bunu üstüge alğan bolsa, Uyğur sotununki heç qandaq bir hacəti yoxdur bu işlərə qaraydigan.
Borne in mind that the allegations made, much of the evidence provided by witnesses, may come from people predisposed against PRC, against the Communist Party, the CCP of China, or against communism itself. Now, it would be errant to conceive of the tribunal's work as the examination of a presumed bad state.
Yani bu qısqartmasını etqan vaqtda bu Uyğur sotununki asaslıq ən axırqı qararı bir hökumətni, yəni bu Xitay hökumətini bir naçar hökumət degan bundaq bir köz qaraş bilan emas, faqat dalil faktlar bilan ən axırqı qararını çıxırışını məqsəd qılğan deb Men faqat qısqaça düşendirme çünki
its own values being
o'xshash
determined
vaqtda so'zlab hammani
its
tarjim qilish
actions are
intayin
contrary to
qiyin.
international norms
Shuni bir
or
qo'shimcha tushuntirib qo'yay
international
dedim
law.
qarindoshlarga.
And avoiding prejudgment or prejudice may be achieved by thinking the PRC and the
Yani
CCP
bir
as
sotninki
congruently
nayda adil
bearing
qarar bo'lish uchun
the same ethic standards
sotchilarninki
that they may be shown
oldi bilan
in
bir
part committing
qarlug'uchini
bad acts. And
o'zininki
no other
xiyolida
style
yoki
for
o'zining
investigation is possible
fikri
there.
bo'yicha bu qarlug'uchi yoki
Recognize
Xitoy
that actions seen as totally
hukumatiniki
wrong and
nachar
beyond
bir hukumat
justification
degan
by
mushundoq
citizens
bir
of
nima
liberal
bilan
democracies
qaror
might,
qilish
to
emas.
citizens of China, seem genuinely acceptable and justified for the public good. And so, I repeat, we have to partition out what may be unquestionably beyond justification and in breach of internationally recognized norms as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human
Hamda
Rights
Xitoy
on the laws
hukumatininki
of
nurg'un
genocide,
qilmishlari
crimes against humanity,
ba'zi
according to the set
o'z hukumati
aside that
xalqlari
which is
yoki ba'zilarning nazarida
unquestionably
normal
beyond
bo'lishi mumkin.
justification from what
Ammo
the
bu
citizens
jinoyatni
of
o'tkazmaganligi,
might find
ya'ni Xitoy
unrighteous.
hukumatining Xinjiangdagi millatlarga olib borgan
And it's also
bu
necessary
jinoyatlari
to look at the
faqat
events that
yanalam
we've
butun
heard
isbotlar,
through a
dalil
clear lens. Countries are entitled to maintain their borders.
Yani
And
birisi
entitled
har
could be
qandaq
seen as a
davlatlarninki
destructive of violence
o'zininki
that governments
chegarasini
display.
qo'g'dash uchun
It has to be
nurg'un
recognized that where separatist
siyosatlarni
movements
qo'llanishi
exist, they
bularni
often
biz
involve
buni
or lead to
tushunamiz.
lethal and other violence where blame may be difficult to apportion. The
Yani
response by states to
hukumat
terrorism or
bir
separatism may result in the suspension of previously accepted norms, rather than
yani
refuting
ba'zi
coming into
hukumatlar o'zininki
tension with our
masalan
tribe
terrorga
or
qarshi
national history.
ya'ni
Some citizens
boshqa
use
bir
consent may
o'ziga
tolerate
bo'lgan
or even prefer
tahdidlarga qarshi
authoritarian governments
normal
attempting
bo'lgan
to dismantle
siyosatlarni
liberal democracy,
buni
and they may
o'zgartirish
accept,
bu
may
ahvolmi
tolerate
nurg'un
the use of
davlatlarda
physical
bo'ladi.
force and violence in pursuit of state aims that would seem anathema to those in liberal democracies. Notwithstanding these differences, the tribunal has been determined to apply universal standards.
Yani muşularni o ko'z qarashlarni ko'zdan kechirib turib Uyg'ur sotininki
With these
eng oxirida
cautions
yanalam
in mind,
xalqaro
just to
qonunlarininki o'lchimi
start,
bo'yicha
evidence
butun
from witnesses, fact witnesses, heard at the tribunal's hearings in June
butun
and September,
dalil
which was
faktlarni
largely accepted by the tribunal,
faktlarga tayandı yani.
show that in Xinjiang, at the hands of some part or parts of the PRC government of the CCP, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs, with some estimates well in excess of 1 million, have been detained by PRC authorities without any or any remotely sufficient reason.
Yani
And subjected to
bu
acts of
Uyg'ur
unconscionable
sudi
cruelty,
butun
brutality,
qabul qilgan bu
Fifteen
shaxslarninki
people detained in cells
bergan
20 square
faktlarni
meters,
asos jihatdan
not possible to
haqiqat
lie down on the
deb
concrete,
bularni qabul
butlers,
qildi.
toilets
Yani
being used
buningdagi
in full remove order in the cell,
qiyin
observed and
qistoq
rendered vulnerable by
turmalarda
CCTV.
lagerlardagi
Many of those
bo'lgan bu
detained were tortured for no reason by such
hech
laymen
qandaq
as
bir
pulling off
sababsiz
fingernails
tutilgan va
and being
sababsiz
considered,
qiyin
being detained in
qistoqlarga
high chairs
elingan.
where feet and hands are locked in position for hours or days without
Yani
a break.
bizningki
Being confined
şahitlarning
in
bergan
containers up to
bütün
the neck in
shu
cold water, being
turmalardagi
detained in cages so
zo'ravonliklarni
small
hozir
that
o'qib
standing
chiqyapti,
on large
tushuntiryapti.
would
Bularning
seem
hammasini biz
impossible.
qabul qildik.
Many of those detained have been shackled by heavy
Yani
metal weights on
nurg'un
their feet,
shu
sometimes with hands and
tutqunlarninki
feet connected with ropes
bütün
for months
tömür
on end.
kishanlar bilan zanjirlangan
Detained women and men have been raped,
ayollarninki
subjected to extreme
jinsiy
sexual violence. One
zo'ravonlik
young woman was
uchirganligi.
treasure of anyone was gang raped by
Yani bir
policemen
20
by the
bir
wrong
22
incident.
yoshga kirgan ayolninki
Being
qizninki
ordered that they would
yuzlarcha kishilarning oldida jinsiy
Women
zo'ravonlikqa
gay detainees
uchraganligi.
have had their vaginas and rectums penetrated by electric shock
Yani
rods with
ayollarninki
iron bars.
jinsiy
Women
yo'llarga
were raped by men in detention
tok
centers, paying for their
degandek
livelihoods
mushu
for the purpose
naydi
of
ig'izga
detaining people
elish
they would
tas
then with food very sufficient
zoravallıklar doğrusuda bunu düşündürüp çıkardı.
food that could at a whim curtail
Hem de yemekten mi yemek
detainees
bämi
decided to solve
gellik
confinement
bu
with lifestyle
türmelerde
normalized.
bazı çırak öçürülmegen yoki çırak yok qarаңғы öýlerde günlerce
The evidence
solanıqallyk.
before the tribunal in written and oral form is available on the website. Full understanding of the treatment of Uyghurs
Hem de
is only
muşu
possible through
paketlarning hemisi Uyghur sodynyňki tor betide iniq elan kılıngan bunun hemisini özüňe körüp alaysızlar.
contain accounts of mental and physical cruelty and suffering.
Yani
Serves just
bu
cause sustained
cismani psixiki jihatki jinsi bu zoravallıklarning hemisi iniq yazılgan, iniq bayan kılgan.
Some evidence of detainees, often comparatively young detainees,
Yani bazı
being removed themselves by force,
ölümlerinin sadır bolganlygy bunundan ma habar aldyk we bazı yaş tutqullarınki türmüden ip çıkılıp yani özünki şu kamerlarını elip çıkıp qaytyp kämigenligi
detainees are allowed
bu
back
doğrulukmu
into society,
paketlarga
sometimes
egellendik.
after a short period of detention as 3 to 6 months, sometimes then to be detained again.
Yani bu türmege solanğanlar bəziləri 3-6 ay bolğan, lekin qaytadan yana tutulğan. Ama her qitim tutulğa wagtlarda zoravallyk tän jazasy qiyyn qıstaqlarga uçurgan.
President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, wrote to the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom last year, saying nobody could watch a segment of a BBC program in which he appeared and failed to notice the similarities between
Merivendi Zelengeliyaninki Yahudi Kiňeşininki baş reisi 2020 ýyl 7-nji aýda Xitay hökümetige ýazgan, Xitay Angliýadagi baş elçisige ýazganda mundaq digen, yani muşu enjümaninki filmside kögen hemmedem köreläýdi ki bu körnüş, yani 75 yıl ilgiri ilgiriki bolgan bu ahvallar, yani Yahudilerninki beşiğe kelgen ahvallar bilen bunu selişdigan. Hem de Uygurlar bolgan hazırki bu vaziyet bunu çoň qırgınçılıkka selişdiramaýmyz. Bunu biz onunla selişdirmedik, yani Yahudilerninki çoň qırgınçylykka uçurganlygy.
Genocide in law is more broadly defined than the common conception of mass murder of a specific group. Genocide in law can be established by actions that result in the killing of no one. Although such a form of the crime has never in over 70 years been dealt with to conclusion on that basis alone by any court. And so these are matters that the tribunal has had in mind, together with the need to respect how the term genocide
Yani bu qırgınçılıkninki asas kanuni, yani 70 ýyldan köprek wagt içidiki her qandaq sotnyň özü ýekünlegen bir tarap qılmaganlygy, bunun yetersizlik tarapları bulanı düşündür ötdi hazır. Hem de bu sotninki qandaq qılıp delil isbatlarını toplaganlyk toğrusida düşünce berip atdy. Yani asaslyk bägen şu ağzaçy bägen isbatlarını toğra, rast dep qabul kıldyk. Elbette bäzi sözler belkim %100 bolmasmy, belkim ularninki zoravallyk we genayty eger işlerini beşinden keçirgenligi üçün belkim unutup kalgan boluşy mümkin digen şundaq köz garaşdy boldy.
This first-hand evidence of witnesses was supplemented approach the evidence on the basis that no adverse factual inference of any kind can
Yani
be
bu
drawn
birinci
against the
qol
PRC or any other
qolumuzga
for
tushgan
failure to
şu
respond to requests.
şahitlarninki
Evidence,
bəyan
your suggestion,
isbatları bilan mutaxassislarninki qonun mutaxassislarning
opinions on final
bütün şu
legislative
hamısını
writing have been read in
gözden keçirip
reports
çıxdı.
and opinions, and I'll refer to some of them later, and indeed heard in evidence by some of you who will have been at the hearings, but no attention is paid to those opinions by the trial.
Yani bəzi mutaxassislarninki yoki shaxslarninki özünki oy fikirləri bo'yicha yezilgan reportlarga Uyghur soti onunğa köngül bölmedi. Çünki biz bütünlay pakt bilan qarar berishda intayin çiң tuduq yani.
Unconnected witnesses, together with documentary evidence, academic papers, media reports, public documents from the PRC, often giving a great deal of detail, provided a uniform picture of life in Xinjiang, showing, for example, the scale and speed of construction of the detention centers.
Yani şahitlərinin, lager şahitlərinin və qoşumçu mutaxassislərinin berilgan bu faktları yani Şinjan'daki Uyg'urlar və başqa millatlarninki hayatının qandaq bir hayat keçirib atqanlığı bir ko'rinishi bizga nayti yo'rtib berdi.
Extrapolate from individual accounts to reach much broader conclusions. From evidence given in person to the tribunal, where the core evidence of all on one fact witness and one expert witness, to which I've already referred, is another list of the factual findings we made. And this is on the basis of the evidence we received.
Yanılar bu şu bütün
Classes in detention center, detainees were forced to
qo'lga
learn
tushgan
examples of
faktlar
cases
to'g'risida tushuncha
in the
beryapti.
presence of guards, risk of being dragged from class, tortured,
Misalga yani
within hearing of those still
atalmış bu tərbiyələş mərkəzlərdəki bolğan ahvallar, məsələn, oxuğucu degan sinifdən zoravallık bilan əchiq ketişi degəndək şu ko'rinishlarni qaytadan tushundiryapti. Hamda şu tutqunlarninki doim bu qon alğanlığı və tuğut çəkləş, operasiya qilish degəndək.
By means of intense monitoring, surveillance, facial recognition, advanced technologies,
Yani yuqur texniklik arqılıq Uyğurlarni kontrol qılğanlığı yani bütün Şinjan'ni bir üstü uç türmü qılğan, türmü bolğanlığı.
Acts of seeming insignificance may arbitrarily have resulted in detention, leading to the destruction of families' livelihoods, as well as the extensive
Yani normalda hiç qandaq bir xatalık deməydigan adətdəki bir hərəkətlərni cinayət deb bularni səbəbsiz tutqan ballarninki neçə aylıq bolğan bu vaxtlarninki ata-analardan ayrıb etiş. Nurgun vaqtlarda ata-analarning özünün ballarninki hayat və hayat emasligini biləməyənligi. Yani ayallarninki özününki xalımıgan aşın dərəcədimi məcburi abaliyat qılırını evatkənligi yani Xitaylarga məcburi toy qilishga məcburlanğanlığı Xitay ərlərninki Uyğur ailələrə qoyulğanlığı və ballarni sual sorab olanınki hayatını atanlarının hayatı toğrusida bilim alğanlığı ve muşu arqılıq tutuş asas qıqanlığı degəndək şulan düşündürürdü.
Often separated from their families, the transferees were forced to live in segregated dormitories. Many emblems of the Muslim faith were removed from buildings.
Yani nurgun Uyghur yani Müslümanlığa ait bu dini cəhətdəki buzğunçuluqlar toğrusida düşündürürdü. Yani Müslümanlığa ait simvollarının və məscidlərinki çıqılğanlığı və normal dini praktislərinki yəni bulanı yani kiçik ballarınki öz tili bilən o dərs eliş bulağa çəklənganligi doğrusuda. Yani köplügen Xitaylarınki Xitaylaşdırış siyasətini qollağanlığı doğrusuda. The PRCs also sought control of Uyghurs living outside China by threats directly. Yani Xitay hökumətininki chet ellərdə turuyatqan Uyğurlarını qandaq kontrol qılğan toğrusida olar təhdid qılğanlığı və bu chet ellərdə yaşayatqan Uyğurlarınki özününki ata-analarından, ailələri bilən əlaqəsinin üzülgənliyi və onların heç qandaq bir xəbər alamayatqanlığı və bəzide ata-analarını uzun yıllık türmələrə solağanlığı toğrusida toplanğan faktlarını düşündürürdü. The PRC announced that various bodies and individuals, including this tribunal, will be subject to sanctions. Let it be quite clear. These sanctions cəza veriş, yəni Xitay hökumətininki Uyğur sotuq bəgən cəzası və bir qancha orqanlara bəgən cəzası toğrusida düşündürürdü. Bu cəza bu Uyğur sotuninki xizmətiga çoğ bir təsir yetkizmədi yəni. I return to the question of reports that have been prepared responsive to what is known to have been or believed to have been happening in the PRC. There are a number of them from reputable organizations. Yani dokladlarınki fakt isbat doğrusida biraz düşünce verməkçi. Yani məsələn bir qatar müstəqil nopusluq reportlarının elan qılınğanlığı bununda Essex sortununki New Line Institute'nin bir qatar yani Yale-Guerre'nin 2021 yılı 1 ayının 29 günüdeki dokladı. Bu dokladlarınki bəzilərinin mühim birinci qolluk faktlara yönəlgənliyi. Yani Bar İnsan Hakları Komitesininki bu advokatını sotqa təklif qılğan, amma bununla sotqa gəlmədi. Yani bəzi bu reportlardaki asası faktlar bilən özümüzün qolumuz düşkən faktlar oxşayan faktlar. Әмді асаслық reportlar yelgürüleninki yani birisi Amnesty International yani bir qancha reportlarninki bu sotqa paylanışqa asas bo'lganligi to'g'risida tushuntiryapti.
that recorded complaints of disappearances with over 11,500 such testimonies having been recorded as at December 2020. There was one specific account of use in a detention center at that type of church, which I've already referred, where a man was
Yani
in the chair,
social media orqali qo'lga tushgan ba'zi
left in the chair,
faktlar
urinating and defecating
bu
for 3 days.
buni tushuntiryapti.
People in the cell not allowed to help interfere of enduring the same experience. He died after release. There's evidence of the return to show trials, something previously condemned by the PRC itself. One, for example, in the northern Xinjiang city of Uyghur in May 2014 had 7,000, mostly Uyghur alleged separatists and terrorists, tried, or show tried.
Yani insanlarninki uç sotqa aprildi degan ba'zi
Significant return
ba'zi
to use of what was
isbotlar misolga G'uljida 7000 kishininki
particularly important progress
atalmış ochiq
in
sotqa
terrorism and the re-education.
sotlanganligi bu isbotlanma o'qib chiqdi.
One account in the leaked police papers demonstrated how mass incarceration of people included invasion of the family of someone detained.
Yani birisi bu saqchininki o'zining bu oshkorlangan hujjatdagi
How they were reacting emotionally
hujjatdagi
to the detention.
Uyg'urlarninki oilasi nazorat qilishdagi report to'g'risida tushuncha beryapti.
Expert evidence more generally. A wide range of expert witnesses gave evidence. They covered many topics, including the history of plans for control of Xinjiang, the political
Endi
structure,
mutaxassislarninki bergan bu sotqa bergan faktlari bu faktlarida hukumatninki siyosati va bu siyosatni yo'lga qo'yishdagi maqsadlari degandek nurg'un bu jihatlardan berilgan faktlarni o'qib o'tyapti.
Interestingly, there's detail of the local control by the local community police and by visiting so-called family members, people of whom I've already referred, and of mass sterilization and of separation of children and families by children being sent to boarding schools.
Yani muşundaq Uyghur ailelerinin kontrolga uçurganlığı, Xitaylarning öylörge kelip nazarat qilishi va ballarni o'zinki ailelerden ayrışı, ata-analardan ayrışı va diniy jihatdagi cheklanmalarga uchrashi degandek mushu reportlar bu bir intayin bir kengri bu dövlətninki ötküzüvatqan cinayet toğrusida bizga bir yo'rt bədi deməkçi.
The Bar Human Rights Report identified routes of the remedy but provided no evidence, and the author of that report was unable to give evidence.
Әмді reportlarninki, o'xshamagan reportlarninki asasi və qandaq yakun chiqargan to'g'risida tushuntiryapti. Masalan, Bar Human Rights'ninki yani inson haqlari institutininki chiqargan reportida inchik tushuntirish bo'lmagan, yani eng oxirgi yakuniga bo'lgan.
In the view of the tribunal, the report failed to deal with several substantive issues of the law on genocide. The Human Rights Watch report concluded that crimes against humanity
Bu insan hakları nazar bu dokladda
existence of the necessary genocidal intent at the time, noting that nothing in the report precluded such a finding, and if such evidence were to emerge, the acts committed against ethnic Muslims in Xinjiang, a group protected by the 1948 Genocide Convention, could support a finding of genocide. The Human Rights Watch witness called for another purpose, confirmed at the time of giving evidence that remained Human Rights Watch view.
yani özünün fikrini şu dokladda elan qilgan fikirlerini düşündürüp ötdi. Bunu
But like most other reports, it suggested that crimes against humanity may have happened, but expressed no view in its main
Mesela
defense
Amnesty'nin
about genocide.
reportida insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat o'tkazganligini tilga olgan, lekin qirg'inchilik ijodiki, esnik qirg'inchilik ijodida hech qanday o'zining fikrini yoki
To the horrors in Xinjiang. To confront evil, the first step is to describe it accurately. It may be reasonable to assume that the Amnesty International report's authors, who felt unable to participate in the tribunal's work directly, were not willing to describe what their report found as genocide. The New Lines report
the New Line Institute'nin report to'g'risida tushuncha beryapti. Professor Packard bilan Diamond'ning bergan buningda yani bularning qarori qandaq chiqqanligi, yani irqiy qirg'inchilik o'tkazyotdi degan bu qarorininki asosiy paketleri ve kanuni göz qarashlarını düşündürüyordu.
objective facts that are attributable to the state, including official statements, general plans, state policy, a pattern of conduct, and repeated destructive acts, which have a logical sequence and result or may result in the whole or part destruction of the relevant group. And the report found that genocide against the Uyghurs established by each and every of the five
Bu bütün irqiy qirg'inchilik ahdnamesidagi hammani analiz qilish orqali bütün Xitoy hukumatiningki Uyg'urlarga qarshi jinoyat, yani irqiy qirg'inchilik o'tkazayotganligini e'lon qilgan, yani yani Xi Jinping şu onunğa eng asasını şu turg'izgan, bir qo'lliq qilgan. Bu New Line Institute'ning report to'g'risidagi tushuncha beradi.
Rejecting the need for proof beyond reasonable doubt suggests that clear and convincing is all that we needed to prove genocide by a state. Now, Professor Packer and Mr. Diamond frame several important questions for the tribunal to consider. But the tribunal, as I've already said, is not the appropriate body to attempt to rule the law on genocide or to run the risk of dealing with genocide other than by the strictest standard of proof.
Yani bu New Line Institute professorlarninki ko'z qarashi, ya'ni bu qonun yetarli emas degan bu jihatga ko'z qarashini Uyg'ur sudi o'ylashmadi, chunki faqat Uyg'ur sudi, ya'ni xalqaro sudidagi hozirgi mavjud bo'lgan qonunlar orqali faktlarga asosan qaror berishni to'g'ri ko'rdi, yani. Yani şu Uyghur sotiga kelib o'zining fikrini ochiq oshkora bayon qilgan bütün kişilerge özünün rahmetini bildirdi.
were hacked in 2019 and leaked through the journalist Yao Dra, whose report
Әмді мұшы Қытай hökumətininki aşkar bolğan höjət doğrusunda düşənçi berib atdı.
group led to the ASPI report, which expresses no opinion at all in regard to criminality. It importantly pointed to the 2014 counterterrorism and 2017 re-education campaigns, and to how the CCP's war against the Uyghurs
Yani
intensified.
şu aşkarlanğan höjətlər arqılıq alğan paktlara qarğanda hökumətinin özünün 2014-cü ildən başlap Uyğurlarga cəng elan qılğanlığı şunu düşəndirdi.
First, the 2017 re-education campaign followed on from the counter-terrorism campaign, was expanded to include mass coerced labor assignments.
2017-ci ildiki bu Uyğurlarni kən köləmdə tutuş və keyinki məcburi əmgək yötkəş və Xitay hökumətininki kadrlarni Uyğurlarning ailələrə
Trinity mechanism, which ensured that every neighborhood
ailələrdə turuşu kontrol qilish yana shu cəhətlərdəki bütün ahvallarni yana qaytadan bu şu hüccətlər arqılıq aşkarlanğan toğrusudaki faktlarni oqub ötüb atıdı.
people really needing pass documents from the committee in order to travel. And it explained how something
Yani Uyğurlarnınki qançılıq kontrol asıda yaşıqanlığı, yani bir yerdən bir yerə beriş üçün qoşumçu ruxsat eliş deyəndək.
answerable to the CCP via, I'll start again, all those subordinate bodies that delivered these policies of control of the Uyghurs answered through the PLAC to the Communist Party. Xi Jinping had dubbed the Political and Legal Affairs Systems, PLAC, as the party's knife handle, and insisted that the handle be held firmly in the hands of the party.
Yani Xi Jinping'ninki
Same report
yeni siyasətdə Uyğurlarga bolğan, Uyğurlarga qartılğan iğir siyasət doğrusunda, yani kontrol qilish və bütün
senior officials promulgating new laws and
yani
regulations
qanun arqılıq yeni qanunlar arqılıq Uyğurlarni kontrol qilishi və zoravallıqqa uçurğanlıq doğrusunda düşəndirdi.
on the ground, it says, local officers openly boasted about acting outside legal process. But they did so with the endorsement of senior leaders and state officials. This report, by the way, is based in part on field work. That's always something.
Bu reportlarninki bəzi reportlar asaslıq aşı mutaxassislarninki yerliklərdən egəlligən faktlarga tayanğanlıq doğrusunda düşəndir.
Invasion of people's homes, merging it with the previous Frankie program, and all of it now becoming answerable to the Xinjiang Party Secretary, Chen Guangguo.
Yani bu Uyğurlarning ailəsiga hücum qilish bu proqramisininki Çinçengo'nun siyaseti doğrusundaki bunu düşənçi berib atıdı.
That's the measure that the evidence shows of the invasion of the people's privacy in order to control them. Finally, from this report, many senior Chinese officials who experienced personal trauma during the Cultural Revolution, much earlier Cultural
Yani bu reportqa asaslanganda nurgun yuqur dərəcəli kadrlar özləri medeniyet inqilobiда ziyankeşlik
Says the report
uçurganlar misal.
were subjected to re-education as teenagers
Özüň
subsequently
ballyk
claimed
wagtlarda
their
muşundaq
experiences of hard labor
terbiyeleşlerge
were transformative.
mecburi
Similarly,
hizmet,
after becoming
mecburi
trained and read to
lekin bunu
survive this
bu
family's ordeal during the Cultural
Buz
Revolution
Xitayninki
presidency,
medeniyet
and the
inqilabida
last
qızıldymy, qızıl bolup
mobilized vast
özüninki
resources of
hayatını
Chinese
saklap kalyş
bureaucrats to
toğrusida
manufacture skills
bayanatlarninki balygyny
for
düşendirip atydy.
transformation. The second report received after the September hearings, the Holocaust Memorial Museum report, was also
Yani birse çoň qırgınçylyk Holocaust Museumninki yollagan report toğrusida bir düşenç berip atydy.
discontent about the state's preferential treatment of Han Chinese people. And it deals with particular rebellions, one in the town of Baron, with a very large number of Uyghurs, over 1,500.
Bunun Xitay hökümetiniň siyasetiге Uygurlarnyňky karşı çykkanlygy, hatda barın waqasy bunun da izilganlygy şularny düşendirip atydy.
Set up the history much more fully, perhaps, than other witnesses had.
Bu reportda texmi inçike tarihi waqalar bilen bunu bu düşendigen yani Uygurlarnyňky ahwalyny
From China generally. It covers the history of a small group of Uyghurs coming together in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and how their presence grew and then diminished and petered out. It deals with violent events in Xinjiang in 1997 and 2008. It deals with the way that the government profiled Uyghurs as terrorists.
Yani hökümetninki Uygurlarny kandak terrorçy degen namny kollanganlygy we bu kollanganlyk sebäp meselen 97-nji ýyly 2009-njy ýyldyky bir türküm waqalarny bularny düşendirip çykdy.
Methods. And in a white paper published in July 2019 by the China's State Council Information Policy, is recorded, according to the report, how it was said that the Uyghurs' Turkic ancestry could be denied.
Yani Xitay hökümetininki 2019-njy ýyldyky white paper ýana höjütde digen Uygurlarnyňky türk bolganlygy bunu inkar kılganlygy yani hökümetninki bu dogurluk düşençi berip atydy.
Or a betrayal that needed to be opposed. Those familiar with other unhappy experiences in other countries may find some resonance in denying people's own history.
Yani bir milletninki özüň taryhyny bütünlej inkar kılış bu başga ýerlerde mi körülgen belki bu 5 ýyl ötgenler bunu es kılalaydı.
Crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment or severe deprivation of physical liberty, and said that in its present report, it was clear that there's now a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity of forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, and forcible transfer are also being committed. If accepted that the limited nature of verifiable information presented challenges to analysis of genocidal intent, and argues that that was by design, the Chinese government continuing to impede the flow of information concerning its crimes, as described against the Uyghurs. The information which has made its way into the public domain, says the report, gives rise to serious concerns that the Chinese government may be committing genocide against the Uyghurs.
Yani qoşumçy reportlarnynki yani Holocaust Museumninki bu reportlarnynki ahyrky özüninki ýeküni yani ama Uygur sotynyňki bu başga reportlarnynki çykagan ahyrky ýekünige tayanmaganlygyny düşendirip atydy. Yani birisi şu Esin Götmen'nin ki Uyghur sotuğu bəgən paktini yüz qabul, yani onunğa tayanmağanlığı bunu işenmegenlik emas, faqat bunun texi yeterlik bolmaganlığı sebebidin bunu toluq asas qılmaganlığını düşündürüyor.
and then used for forced organ harvesting. That is being killed for their organs
Yani
to
bu
be
yaşlarının
extracted
ki yoqab
and
ketişi,
so
ularının ki
there is this organism
işki
fossilized
əzalarına
in terms of
ağa
not just
iliş
the
üçün
fact of the
məqsəd qılğan
disappearance of government
digən.
detainees,
Amma
but
bunun da
evidence of the continuation of the organ transplantation business within
yəni
China
bu
extremely
soğudunun
lucrative
ki
as it is. Mr.
organ
Goodman
ətkəsçilik
identified at least
soğudu
one site
doğrusudur
where
ki
hospital detention center
özünün ki
would have
göz
co-located
qaraşlarını düşündügən.
a hospital and a detention center and a crematorium are co-located a short drive from an airport that has a special express lane in departures for the transportation of
Yani
organs.
nim üçün bu göz qaraşdı
Mr.
bolğanlığını
Goodman does
özü
not claim this
düşündügən,
theoretical
yani
possibility is
nurgun
sufficiently
oxşamağan
confirmed by controvertible evidence, and he's no doubt
ispatlar
continuing
bilən.
his work. If such a practice is going on, then killing Uyghurs and others for commercial purposes would have different objectives and intentions from those being considered by this tribunal. And so it must be left to others to prove or disprove this theory.
Yani bu
Leaked documents. There have been several leaks said to be genuine. When accepted by the tribunal, they will
yani
be
birisi
proved by
aşkarlanğan höcətlər doğrusudur düşüncə
alleged
berib atıdı.
irregularities that they have. And so far as the tribunal know, none of the leaked documents has been challenged as to cause
Bütün
them unreliable.
aşkarlanğan höcətlərin hamısı Xitay
It's worth observing
hökumətinin ki
that the leaking of material is evidence
qanuni
that there are errors
höcətləri
within
dəb
China
qəbul qılındı, yəni
that may
bunu
disagree with the overall policies of government under which they live. There's a full account of all the leaked documents provided by Amnesty, and that's in the judgment that will be on the website quite soon.
yəni bu qolğa düşən bütün dokladlar, höcətlər hamısı tor betində elan qılındı, yəni.
Which came directly to this tribunal from a source that cannot be identified during the September evidence hearings. Following a preliminary assessment, it was determined that an academic with pre-existing knowledge of the matters to be dealt with should be engaged to analyze the documentation.
Yəni bu sotun qolğa 2000 muşu yıl 9-cı ay ətrafında
Dr. Zen's was approached in London
qolğa düşən höcət doğrusudur düşüncə berib atıdı.
were made from the materials
Yəni
passed
Xitay hökumətinin ki aşkarlanğan höcəti
peer reviewers, Professor James Millward,
Dr. Agents James Millward'ın ki sotqa bəgən bayanatı
New York Times
isbatı
was not the New York Times itself. Dr. Zen's, Professor Millward, Dr. Tobin reported on the documents in a live
Dr. Tobin bular hamısı şu report arqılıq bu reportni aşkarlığan və bunu düşüncə bəgən bu doğrusu düşüncə bədi.
provision of documents or attendance of witnesses, but it has sought material from various sources known to contain material of value. So requests were made to the United States, United Kingdom,
Yəni dövlətlərdən biz höcət tələb qıldıq, lakin heç qandaq bir dövlət bizə bu toğrusunda bizninki tələbimizni rədd qıldı, yəni.
and correspondence relating to the seeking of all this material is going to be provided in due course as one of the appendices to the full document. Nothing will be held against the PRC or against anybody else for non-provision of material. However, it's noted that where there are matters of information, there are, of course, matters of information that government
Yani bu
is
hökumətlərinki
tribunals
bizning
as
talab
well
qilgan bu
to
hüccətlərini
seek
bəməsliki, bunun
documents
toğır
available by those that
bolmağanlığı
are not certain.
toğrısıda özününki fikrini bayan qılatıdı.
They might have relied on confidentially, for example, the US making assertions about genocide but producing no supporting
Yani
material,
misalga
or would rely on themselves
Amerikaninki
in
bu
some respects.
Xitay hökuməti qırğınçılıq ötküzətidi degan qararını bəgən, lekin hech qandaq bununğa
Very unfortunate.
qandaq bu yakun
That's not the
chiqqanlıq
case.
toğrısıda jaryanını
Finally,
elan
on
qılmagan və
matters of
bizə
process like
qolumuzga
diversity,
tələb
it's
qılğandı
worth
bu
remembering that several
materiallarını
parliaments around
bizə
the world
bəməyən
have voted
muş
in general
toğrısıdımı
terms
düşənçi bədi hazır.
to assert that genocide has been happening in Xinjiang following debates that demonstrated a high level of public concern
Yani
for the process.
parlamentlarda Xitay
Tribunals also have
hökumətininki
access to the
Uyğurlarga
briefing papers of all those
qırğınçılıq
different
ötküzüb
parliaments
degan bir
before the
qancha
implementation
parlamentlarda
of the debate. It
bu
hasn't declared
talaş
precisely
tartışlar boldy və
on what
qararlar
legal
boldy.
basis those assertions
Amma bu
were made.
qararlarningki
And I guess
qandaq
it's possible
qanunlarga
that in some
tayanğanlıq
parliaments
eniq
that
emas
those
yani.
assertions may have been associated with collateral political objectives.
Hem de bunun bəlkə siyasi məqsədi
Tribunals'
boluşu mümkün degan
decision
bu
making has been methodical.
közdən keçirildi yəni
Separate
bu
involved witness statements and evidence, reaching factual conclusions based on that evidence.
hem de
And it's
Uyğur
considered reliable and
sotininki
then finally
qararı
tribunals
yanılam
decide.
qaydalavatudu ki, bütünlay şu faktlarga
Further, the
tayanğanlığı
fact
mütəxəssislərinki,
that
qanun
required
şünaslarınki və ən mühimi şu Uyğurlarning
that will eliminate uncertainty for all and avoid
Uyğur
any
şahidlərinin.
possible unfairness falling on the PRC. Another general matter, which I'll summarize because of the passage of time. It's important to realize that when evidence is given of detention, torture, surveillance, invasion of people's homes, it's necessary not just to look at it from the point of view of the person suffering what's happened, but to realize that that very evidence is evidence of people doing those things to them and being willing to do those things to them.
Yani birisi inaydi düşendirişke muhim bolgan bir misalga insanlarning zor avallıqı uçurganlıqı, qiyin qыстaq uçurganlıqı. Bunun da faqat şu zor avallıqı uçurgan kişininki azabını lam düşünüş emas və muşu ziyankeşlik və cinayətni ötküzgənlərninki məqsəd, məsələn, qandaq bir məqsəd bilən ötküzgənligi, kimning kimning buyruqi orqali ötküzgənligi degandek bu jihatlardan tushuncha beryapti.
Not just the suffering of the victims, but there are thousands of individuals who planned the systems in operation, were trained and trained others to do what was necessary to bring the systems into force.
Bununki bir kişiga yoki necha yuz kishiga bo'lgan ziyankeşlik emas, buningdagi minglagan kishilarning mushu jinoyatlarni o'tkazish uchun yuqoridan bularga bergan vazifasi va mushu ko'plik hatto ba'zi mutaxassislar, professorlar, doktorlar bularniki Xitoy hukumatining sistemlik yana bir millatga qartgan jinoyatiga sherik bo'lishga majbur bo'lganligi yoki o'zligidan xalab qolganligi mushu jihatlarni ko'zdan kechirish kerak demoqchi.
The tribunal then moved to some big general fact-finding. Was there a plan?
Hamda bütün qo'limizga tushgan materiallar hamma isbotlardan keyin eng oxirida yana bek mo'yim bir jarayon plan bormi, ya'ni hukumatningki planimi bu maqsadli qilganmi demoqchi.
Responsibility for what was going on allowed the perceived security threat posed by the Muslim
Yani Xitay hökümetininki nem üçün Uygurlarni qarlaş, terrorga çetişlik toğrusudaki yani özününki bexatarligi, siyaseti yani 2013 yılı Xi Jinping'ninki Xinjiang'ni ziyaret qilishi ve ahırda bu Uyghur terrorchilarga hech qandaq bu terror deb bekitganligi degan mushu jarayonni tushuntiryapti.
When Chen Quange was appointed party secretary in 2016, coming from Tibet,
Yani Xinjiang'ninki 2016 yılı Tibet'ten yo'tkab kelib partiya sekretari bo'lganligi ve onundan keyingi onun yürgüzgen siyaseti yani 2017 yıldaki aşkılık karşı siyaseti
General Officer of the Standard Committee of the Region's People's Congress said it was emphasized that regulations constitute the implementation of central government policy, decisions and deployment, especially in order to implement the important instructions and requirements of General Secretary Xi Jinping. Other matters of history include a policy intensified in 2018 associated with
bu yerda yanilam shu Xitoy hökumətininki siyaseti və Uyğurlarninki Uyg'urlarga qartılgan siyaseti to'g'risida tushuncha beryapti. Bular hammasi yozma tarjima qilindi. Men faqat bugun asosliq Sir Jeffrey Nice apandimninki so'zninki mazmunini tushuncha beryapman. Çünkü bu material mening qo'limga oldin ola tushmaganligi uchun buni tarjima qilishim biroz men uchun sal tez. Shuning uchun buni to'g'ri tushunishinglarni umid qilaman qarindoshlarningki.
before the receipt of the leaked Xinjiang papers in September of this year, this tribunal concluded that the policies that require construction of hundreds of buildings, deployments of thousands or more likely hundreds of thousands of personnel are very insubstantial.
Yani bu yıl 9. ayda qo'limizga bu oshkorlangan hujjat qo'limizga tegmagan shu vaqtdimi butunlay bu bo'lgan voqealar va isbotlarga qarab Uyghur soti buningki hukumatninki sistemlik plan bilan bo'lganligi bu yani hukumatning siyosati va yuqoridan plan bilan bo'lganligini qabul qilgan. Hamda bu hujjat shu qarorining to'g'riligini isbotladi yani.
You'll find in the document when it's available further detail about leadership and central government responsibility.
Report e'lon qilingandan keyin sizlar bu hukumatninki siyosati aniq e'lon bo'lindi. Buni tushunib olasizlar. Masalan, Xitoy masalan Tobin doktor Tobinninki reportida buni aniq bayon qilingan. Masalan, Xi Jinping uning siyosati qadam Uyg'urlarni kontrol qilish siyosati inchki yozilgan buningda. James Millward'ninki bergan bayonoti yani milliy esnik siyosati to'g'risida tushunchalarni tushuncha bergan. Buni tushuntiryapti.
Confirms the understanding by Millward PRC's policies of such importance to the perceived national security threat was initiated and directed by the party secretary of the CCP, SMG.
Yani bu
Given the history from the apparatus of
mutaxassislarninki
state power
bəgən
by the most senior officials,
isbatları
including members of
şunu
the
deydi
Standing
ki,
Bureau.
hökumətninki, yəni Xitay
Documents from
hökumətinin
2014
siyasəti
show that President Xi
ən yuqur,
authorized
yəni
the
Xi
local Xinjiang
Jinpingninki
government to draft
bir
a
qulluq
blockade
şunun buyruğu boyunca
regulation,
bolğanlığı.
which is intimately linked to all the measures of
Yəni
the
bu
occurred
dövlətninki
from
bexətərligini bana qılıb kontrol
The speeches made in
və
2014 by President Xi with other top officials
həm də
contributing were
Xi
managed to be
Jinpingninki
studied
bəzi
by party and state power
aşkarlanğan
as they contained
sözləri,
strategic
yığıllarda
response
qalğan
by the
sözləri
Party Central
toğrusudaki
Committee for Xinjiang
şularını
work
düşüncə
and
berýärdyr.
aim to convey and learn the spirit of General Secretary Xi Jinping's series of important speeches. A second series of speeches in 17 and 18 directly
Yəni 17-ci il, 18-ci ildəki bəzi bayanatlardakı Uyğurlarga qarılğan siyasəti, bopmu Çinçəngonun, Zhuxaylinninki siyasi bu Uyğurlarga qartılğan siyasətləri özünün sözlərində aşkarlanğan, yəni.
These documents are the highest and second highest classification. Some of the documents are absolutely
Əmdi bulan ayti məxfi hüccətlərlikin bununki siyasət yəni şu Xi Jinping'in kəgəllikini isbatlanğanlığını düşündürüyordu. Nə Uyğur soti bu ən yuqur dərəcəli kadrlarınki, yəni Xi Jinping, Jinping, Zhuxaylindəki kişilərin qolu bilən bir qolluq planlagan və icra qılğanlığı qəbul qıldı. Yəni bu ən yuqur dərəcəli kadr, yuqur dərəcəli kişilərinki buyruq bolmagan bolsa, bu işlərin boluşu mümkün bolmadı deməkçi. Can I have break, please?
The tribunal is satisfied that within the PRC's penal system, barbaric, cruel, and sadistic torture has been perpetrated. The tribunal is satisfied so far as rape and sexual violence is concerned that rape and other sexual violence within the penal system was widespread. So far as regional and cultural destruction is concerned, satellite imagery identified the destruction of
Uyğur sotununki qəbul qılğan qaysı cinayətlərinki isbat bolğanlığı, tən cəzası, qinaş, bunun mövcudluğunu qəbul qılğanlığı, cinsi zoravallıq, Uyğur din və mədəniyyət yoxduş siyasətininki həqiqətlikini qəbul qılğanlığı. Yəni Uyğurlarınki dini ziyankeşlik uçurğanlığını qəbul qılğanlığı, məsələn, məscidlərini çıqılğan toğrusudaki bütün şu paktlarını qəbul qılğanlığı. Yəni məcburi yoxdu ötüş, məsələn, nurgun Uyğurlarınki özünün uruq tuqqanlarının yoqab ketkenligi, bunun mu həqiqətlikini qəbul qıldı, yəni həqiqət. Yani mыңлаған Uyg'urlarninki bu majburiy yo'qitilib etganligi bu to'g'risidagi faktlarni qabul qilganligi va buningga ishonganligi tushuncha beryapti.
Uyghurs without substantive cause and without any recognizable or legitimate legal process. I turn to the issue of birth control, which occupies
Endi shu
and maybe is of
tug'ut kontrol qilish, ya'ni
and it may actually be better first
eng muhim
to go
jihatki.
to the conclusion and then to explain the component parts of it. The conclusion in paragraph 135 is that the tribunal is satisfied that the PRC has effected a deliberate, systematic and concerted policy
Yani bu Uyg'urlarninki
the population in Xinjiang
Uyg'urlarning
by means of a long-term
sonini kontrol qilish yoki azaytish uchun tutgan siyosati buningki
limiting and reducing Uyghur births.
yani Uyg'urlarning tug'ilish nisbatini tuvallatishni sistemlik siyosat bilan ipaganligini qabul qilganligi.
First of all, there's the public policies on birth.
Bu to'g'riliqmi shu siyosatni, ya'ni Xitoy hukumatining o'zining tug'ut kontrol qilish, Uyg'urlarni kontrol qilish siyosatini tushuntiryapti hozir.
In the place that for so many centuries has been their home. That is what's material, the natural birth rate. And then we will learn about, from evidence, including from evidence produced by China, by the People's Republic of China, until such time as it stopped providing figures of the extraordinary decline in birth rate.
Yani Xitoy hukumatining o'zininki hujjatlari, burungi hujjatlarininki ama yaqinqi zamonlarda bu tug'utning azab ketib qolgan to'g'risidagi hujjatlarni oshkorlamaganligini buni tushuntirib o'tdi.
Religious extremism with population growth of a reference to
Yani diniy oshqunlikni bu millatninki ko'payishini kontrol qilish ikkisini
technically allowed and
musha orqali o'zininki shu siyosatini to'g'ri deb
as is revealed in something
justification deymiz, shu siyosatini tushundi hozir.
2017, the birth control policy was intensified.
2017 yılı bu kontrol texmo kuch ilib berilganligi to'g'risida tushuncha beryapti.
Special campaign to control birth violations. That led to or was associated with the steep rise in prosecutions and internments, to which I've just referred.
Yani mushu siyosatdan keyin ko'plagan kishilarninki mushu sababdan, ya'ni tug'ut planliq tug'utga bo'yicha shu siyosatiga bo'ysunmaganligi uchun tutilib ketishi va nurg'un ziyonkashlikka uchraganligi to'g'risida faktlarning bo'lganligi to'g'risida tushuncha beryapti.
Figures for the fitting of these special intrauterine devices that can only be removed surgically are very significant when you compare the figures for Xinjiang.
Yani ayollarga majburiy uzuksi sağan buningki sonini oldingi yillarga serishtirgan vaqtdagi bu masalan 100 ming yani bu sonininki cho'ng o'zgarish bo'lganligi, ko'payganligi buningdan shu
In 2019, the authorities formulated a plan to conduct widespread sterilization in
Andan 2019 yıldaki misalga Xotanda ayollarniki majburiy operatsiya qilish siyosatininki bu oshkorlanganligi
Of course, the tribunal has heard multiple witnesses
Yani Uyghur sotu bir qancha şahitlarninki özünün beşidən ötkenlerini anlatqalığı. Məsələn, doktorlar, bir doktor ayalninki Uyghur sotuda bəgən şahit ispat doğrusu da düşünce beriyatdı da hazır. Ballarını qandaq hayat doğulgan ballarını öldürüş siyasetleri muşular hemisi bir milletninki sanının azıyışı mecburi halatda boğallığı ispatlanğan.
Shows things as clear as anything can be, because sometimes pictures are better than words.
Yani
Between 2015
grafik
and 18,
arqılıq
the natural
bu
population growth of Uyghurs in the southern Xinjiang
Uygurlarninki
prefecture
sanınınki
declined
azlığallığı
by 73%.
yani
And in 2018
73%
and 19, in several countries, it
düşüp
dropped to
ketken
zero
hiç
or
kimin.
became negative. Across 29 counties with indigenous majority populations for which there is data, the birth rate fell by 55%
Yani bu
in
hüccetlerninki
2011
asas
to 14.
bütün
And in those counties with
Uygurçaga
over
tercüm
90%
kılınıp elan
indigenous,
kılındı. Bu
which were over
inçki
90% indigenous, the
cetki
birth rate fell to
analiz
even rate.
yazmadın körü alalayısla.
And so it is that material overall that led to the conclusion that I already read to you. This analysis by Dr. Zenz,
Şu Doktor Zenz ve başka mütehassislerninki reportları yani fakt bilen bəgən bu bular hamısı muş Uyghur sotu da qabul qılındı yani bununki
the so-called optimization
işençlik material, işençlik boğanlığı.
has three components in the judgment of the tribunal. In-migration and hand encouraged press to move into Xinjiang.
Yani mesela Xitaylarni çoğun köləmlik yötkeş yani Uygurlarni iki milli kimlikligini yo'qotishni maqsad qilgan
But the most
bo'lgan.
effective policy lever was the reduction of weak.
Yani eng bularning ichidagi eng ig'ir siyosat deymi shu bolalarning tug'ilishini
Chinese government figures record
majburiy
43%
to'xtatganligi
increase
va Uyg'ur
to 880,000
Uyg'urlarga
primary and middle school Uyghur children being placed in hand-run and
Uyg'ur
hand-starved
ballarninki o'zininki oilasini ayirib Xitoy
deliberately designed
hökumətininki ayrıb etiliş məqsədində selinğan məktəblərdə əkətgənligi bu doğrusudurmu? Düşüncə beriyatdı. Yəni məcburi.
sometimes parents being interned themselves. Families completely broken up and the children being turned towards or into hand culture.
Yəni bu ballarını bütünlüy Xitay
PRC is involved in a deliberate
Xitaylaşdırış siyasətini qollanğanlığı.
families into state care for the purpose of eradicating their Uyghur cultural identity and connections. Forced labor touched on already a little.
Yəni məcburi əmgək doğrusudur ki, qolluğa kəlgən isbatlar doğrusudur düşüncə beriyatdı hazır.
Cases reside in internment camps. And according to state media, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs have been inducted into labor programs.
Yəni Xitay hökumətininki aşkara Uyğurlarni işgirləgi əzən əmgək küçü qılıb ipmanğan doğrusudur bu düşüncələrini beriyatdı. Yəni məcburi əmgək.
Security, profit, population optimization.
Yəni birisi hökumətininki iqtisadi paydalanışla emas milli kimligini yo'qotishni maqsad qilganligi to'g'risida tushundirdi.
Taking a slight diversion. In the very recent period, the tribunal heard from sociologist and genocide expert Dr. Ton Zwan
Әмді bu Uyghur sotununki kanunu cəhətdə qaysı kişilərin kanuni fikirləri yoki şu asas qılğanlığı doğrusu düşənç qıvadıdı. Məsələn, Zıvan, Ton Zıvanның doğrusudaki kanuni cəhətdəki düşəndirvadı, yəni mütəxəssis doktor yəni birisi doktor Ləmkinninki 48-ci ili tərəfindən qəbul qılınğan irqi qırğınçılıq cinayəti.
For the sociologist, Lemkin was both a lawyer, but by the time he was doing this, he was really thinking in sociological terms. He said it's intended as genocide to signify a coordinated plan of different actions.
Bu irqi qırğınçılıqnınki qanun cəhətdəki düşənçiləri boyunca düşəndirvadı. Yəni Ləmkinninki qandaq bunun göz qaraşdı bolğan Zıvanninki göz qaraşları deməkçi.
In a general sense, genocide can be seen as an organized process of systematic persecution, destruction of a considerable group or category of people by other people under the auspices of a state or political regime. Who belongs to the target group is defined by the persecution.
Bəklam qanuni cəhətdəki mürəkkəb düşəndirişlər bunun yazmasını oxuvasanlar boldu. Asaslıq qanun cəhətdəki mühim nöqtələrini düşəndirvadı da.
Genocidal infrastructure of leading ideas where a cluster of ideas is dominant and determines the outlook and policies of the future of the political elite at the helm of the state. And in those circumstances, says Dr. Swan, mass atrocities and genocidal activities have a high chance of following. But China, he suggests, that the Chinese authorities may refrain from genocidal mass killing. The regime and its security services dispose of many means of what are called crushing techniques, already developed in Mao's time. Sharp surveillance, forced re-education in schools, detention camps, forced labor, endless restriction on movements and harassment. And he suggests that the victims stay alive, but, this is the sociologist talking, their freedom of living is nevertheless to a high degree destroyed. For him, genocide may be rooted or take root in many policies with different intentions, and he was disinclined to allow for good motives of the state to be associated with bad, where genocide was happening or is likely to occur. But of course, he accepts, as must be accepted, that protection of the state against terrorists and protection by a state at its borders can always be a legitimate state action. And then finally, and for any who think the present allegations of genocide need not be taken seriously, because mass killing is not alleged. Dr. Swan reminds us intentions are not fixed givens. But they tend to evolve and develop over time. In the case of the murder of the Jews by German National Socialists, it took more than 7 years and the outbreak of World War II before their anti-Semitism culminated in the destruction that Jews should be killed. In the Ottoman Empire and Nazi Turkish nationalism, the idea
Hazır bütünlay şu qanunninki, yəni irqi qırğınçılıq qanunninki cəryanı və şulan düşənçi berwatıdı. Bununki yazması, yazma tercümesi çok uzun vaqt qalmay e'lon qilindi. Shuning uchun Uyghur qarindoshlarningki shuni saqlasanglar bo'ldi. Men hozir asli boshqa birisi almış kerakdi. Men bir soatini eshib ketdi hozir, 1,5 soat bo'ldi. Shuning uchun kechirsizlar men bu hozirgi butun berayotgan qonuniy jihatdagi tushunchalarni tarjim qilishga biraz
Sociologists identify genocide. Sensing from what Dr. Swan said,
biraz qiynalib
how
qoldim.
what is happening to the Uyghurs may appear to a sociology genocide expert may not be unhelpful to those having to focus on what may be a legally defined one. On genocide, on intention itself, genocidal intention, the sociologist's view, firmly expressed by Dr. Swan in a written note, about the difficulty of proving intent. As the lawyer's recurring problem in genocide's trial. Dr. Swan's evidence doesn't loosen the tests that must be applied for any finding of genocide in law. It does help explain.
Yani en mühimi bu ırkı qırğınçılıqni isbatlaş bu bir dövlətninki məqsədimuş bu məqsədni isbatlaşnınki nəyət qiyin bolğanlığı toğrusida bunu bu düşüncə bədi hazır.
It was decided not to try and involve other English legal experts into what was by now a sanctioned environment, and we turned instead to Andrew Koo from Malaysia and then to his direction myself, whose independence and legal skills were valuable. He worked with counsel who were already within the sanctioned
Hazır
environment.
qanunşünaslarnınki Uyghur sotuğa qanun cəhətdən yardım qılğanlığı toğrusida biraz düşüncə berýärdi. Yani qiyin qıstaq qilish əhdinamə bu bütün qolumuzdaki ispatlar arqılıq bununğa Uyghur sotu qanaatləndi, yəni bunun həqiqətligiga. Həqiqət bolğanlıqıga. Yani insaniyyətə qarşı cinayətlər üçün bir qancha türlər isbatlanışı kerak. Yani puhralarga qarşı kengir kölemdeki sistemlik buzgunçuluk qilish. Must know that there is a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population and that his or her acts are part of that attack. He doesn't have to know the detail of the policy, he has to know at least that. Finally, for genocide, certain prohibited acts, if committed, irq qırğınçılıq isbat üçün, yani bir milletninki yoki bir grupninki bir qismi yoki qismlarini yo'qotish va buni yo'qotishninki asosli maqsad qilgan buni isbot qilish misol.
Protected groups are national, ethnical, racial, religious groups, and no other. The underlying prohibited act, at least one of which has to be proved, is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm. Longer definition if you can read them.
Yani bu qırğınçılıq əhdinaməsindəki bir qancha asas qilgan to'g'riliq tushundirib o'tadi, ya'ni o'ldirish, millatni ballarni ayirish, tug'ut cheklash degandek bir qancha tur. Ya'ni maqsadlik vayron qilish yoki buzg'unchilik qilish to'g'risidagi tushuntirish.
Physical or biological destruction of all or part of the group. When looking at genocide and what has to be proved and against whom or what, the perpetrator is now not the lower level perpetrator. The person
Yani
actually
bu
doing
qirg'inchilikni isbotlash uchun bir hukumatninki odatki bir kishi emas, buningki yuqur darajalik kishining bo'lganligini isbotlash
has
kerak.
two inferences, where an inference is drawn as to specific intent, that inference must be the only reasonable inference from the totality of the evidence.
Yani birisi bu maqsadlik qilganmi, qasddan qilganligi, bunimi isbotlash. Hamda hukumatning o'zininki bir 172 hukumat, ya'ni Xitoy hukumatimi bunga qo'l qo'ygan, ya'ni ahdnomaga qo'l qo'ygan.
Prevent genocide, to punish people who may be committing genocide, to investigate genocide.
Yani bu ahdnomaga qo'l qo'ygan hukumatlar bu qirg'inchilik o'tkazayotgan davlatlarni to'xtatishi va qirg'inchilik uchrayotgan millatlarni qo'g'dish majburiyati bor. Yani bu buzg'unchilik jismoniy va biologiyalik bo'lishi kerak, misolga.
First, second, and last draft of the convention, because in the first draft, physical genocide was divided into three types: physical genocide with definitions, biological genocide with definitions.
Yani bu qirg'inchilik birisi tan, ya'ni o'ldirish orqali qirg'inchilik o'tkazgan, birisi biologiya qirg'inchiligi. Yani birisi ballarni majburiy yo'tkash siyosat orqali masalan madaniy qirg'inchilik. Yani birisi qirg'inchilik, ya'ni bu tug'ilishni cheklash, tug'ish cheklash, bir millatninki sonini qasddan kontrol qilish. Bumi shu qirg'inchilik nimasiga kiradiganligi to'g'risida tushuntirib o'tadi, ya'ni.
The tribunal took the view that given the destroy in the convention as finally formulated,
Yani Uyghur sotininki bütün müşahidatlardaki qirg'inchilik ahdnomasidagi qonun hujjatdagi qonunlarga asosan bütün faktlarni ko'rib chiqqanligi va biologiyalik qirg'inchilik, buzg'unchilik buni mushu isbotga nayt inchik qardık yani.
Legal scholars and practitioners often argue that there's little need for genocide, when the formulation of crimes against humanity usually covers all acts that might constitute genocide, and crimes against humanity are equally as serious. The only difference is the particular intent, state of mind required of the potential offender or of the offending state. Without adopting this argument in any way, the tribunal can observe that it might be unwise to venture into territory where the law is not absolutely clear, if that lack of clarity might be used to attack the tribunal's judgment and deflect attention from matters of substance that can, as it happens, be dealt with, if at all, as crimes against humanity. So going through the processes of reasoning, evidence, extra evidence, expert evidence, opinion we disregard, but look at cases straight from the PRC, of the law, and so on. Further conclusions. As to torture, and in summary, the tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that torture has been inflicted throughout the period leading up to 2021 by or at the instigation of or with the consent or the acquiescence of public officials or other persons acting in official capacities of the PRC or the CCP. Turning to crimes against humanity. Before we come to the list of acts that have to be shown, remember, there has to be an attack, it has to be widespread, and it has to be
Yani la qanun cəhətdəki
Was there an attack?
əsaslarını düşəndirədir.
In the PRC, or certainly in Xinjiang, was just suffering the same detention, surveillance, and so on and so forth. To which the answer is no. The number of Uyghurs detained, the number of mosques and graveyards destroyed or rendered unfit for purpose, sterilizations, abortions, repression of language, repression of religion, separation of Uyghurs wholly without justification, that shows there was an attack. Second, was the attack widespread and systematic?
Yani Uyğurlar qarşı hərəkətin boğanlığı, bolmağanlığı, bunun isbatlanğanlığı doğrusunda düşəndüdü misalға milyonlagan kişilərin tutqun buluşu, səbəbsiz yoxdu şey degəndək məşə. Yani birisi kontrol qilish üçün texnikalarning qo'llanganligi, yuqori texnika qo'llanganligi to'g'risida tushuntiradi.
Every facet of legal life, it is hard to conceive of something more systematic.
Bunun sistemlik bo'lganligini, buni
First is murder. For an act of killing to qualify as a crime against humanity, would have to be proof of the intent to kill or cause serious bodily harm.
İnsaniyetga qarşı cinayet, birincisi qatillik, öldürüş. Bunun da aniq bir isbatning bo'lmaganligini tushundirdi. Keng ko'lamlik öldürüş isbatıga ega bo'lmaganligi, bu qo'l yo'q. Yani birisi qul qilish bu siyosati, buningdimi bu to'g'riliqmi, yani haqiqiy qul qilgan bu qonun bo'yicha bu yeterlik bo'lmaganligi, yeterlik isbatning bo'lmaganligi. İnsaniyetga qarşı məsələn sürgün qilish yoki nopsni məcburi yötkash cinayet bu qabul qilindi, yani bu isbatlandi. Yani insanlarınki qiyin qistaqqa, türmelerge bu cəhətdəki isbatlarını qabul qılındı. Bunu insaniyyətə qarşı cinayətlikini cinayətə isbatlandı.
supremacy enforces sterilization and other forms of sexual violence, the next category of that.
Yani birisi bu başqunçuluq, cinsi zoravallık, bularning hammasi qo'lga tushgan isbotlar, paketlar orqali
Definition of rape may encompass invasion of any part of the victim's body. The perpetrator must intentionally commit the act, being aware that
yani bunun məqsədlik bolğanlığı
beyond reasonable doubt this crime
bu sud bu bu xil insaniyyətə qarşı cinayətninki ötküzülgənligini qabul qıldı. Yani bu cinayət bovatıdı deگەndə.
to discriminate on political, racial, ethnic, or religious grounds against an identifiable group, or that are collectively and universally recognized as implicit. Evidence of economic deprivation, of discrimination of a personal nature, of hunger and property, discriminatory judicial and legal practice, of restrictions placed on family life, exclusion from certain professions, restrictions
Yani
placed on
dini,
rights,
iqtisadi, hər cəhətdəki çəkiliniş Xitay hökumətininki siyasəti bu ziyankeşliklərinki mevcutluğu və bunun qabul qılınlığı və bu isbatlanğanlığı.
Apartheid would have come next, but is an incompletely developed crime, is not considered incompletely developed by courts and laws.
Yani insanlarınki mecburi gayib buluş, insaniyetə qarşı turuş cinayeti isbatlanğanlığını şəksiz qabul qıldı, yani razı oldu.
Not specifically enumerated, evidence has been received which could be included within this category. Forcible imposition of hand people into Uyghur family homes, pervasive surveillance system throughout the region, destruction of mosques, repression of religious and cultural expression, forced to coerce marriage, satisfied beyond reasonable doubt.
Uyghur sotununki, yani medeniyetini ifadələş və məcburlaş yoki məcburlaş muşu cəhətdəki, yəni məsələn Xitaylarning Uyğurlarning bütün örf adətiga qılğan buzğunçuluq bununki isbatının to'liqligini bu insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat bo'lganligini qabul qildi, yani.
The widespread or systematic attack against the Uyghur part of the population, so that their acts were part of the attack, even if they had no actual detailed knowledge of the attack overall.
Yani bu sud kollegiyasi qilmish sodir qilg'uchininki Uyg'urlarga qartilgan keng ko'lamlik sistemlik hujum bo'lganligi buning qilmishlarininki bir qismi ekanligini shaksiz qabul qildi, rozi bo'ldi.
Remembering that plan is not essential, but may help in interpreting our plan. The motive is generally irrelevant because what's important is the intent at the moment some act is put into place. The policies may be achieved through genocide, but that's not a critical finding. That a perpetrator's specific intent has to be directed against destruction of a group in part, that's sufficient, as opposed to the whole. But that the part, if it is only going to be against part, must constitute a substantial part of the group, such that it is significant enough to have an impact on the group as a whole.
Yani bu qirg'inchilik to'g'risida ahdinomadagi qonuniy
preventive
talablarni
purpose.
tushundiradi.
The intended measures themselves, together with an intent to biologically destroy,
Yani bo'libmi
would lead
biologiyalik
to the legal
buzg'unchilik qilish, ya'ni
genocide.
bo'libmi tug'ut
The
cheklash,
actual consequence on future birth rates may not be necessary,
yani kelgusi
although
kishilarning
consequences may be
tug'ilishini,
seen already to have had
millatning
adverse effects.
ko'payishini cheklash siyosati.
Then
Bu
that may be
to'g'risida tushuncha
instructive
beryapti.
for identifying what was the perpetrators. This is, remember, perpetrator is the high level people organizing things, running things.
Yani
They
eng
may
yuqori
struggle to
darajalik
identify
ziyankesh
any destruction.
qilg'uvchi,
One
ya'ni
of the things that
ziyankesh
would have to include
zo'ravonlik
genocide, it's incontrovertible
siyosatni
Uyghurs
yo'lga
are a
qo'yg'uchi.
qualified group.
Yani birisi bir Uyg'urlarninki bu alohida bir guruh, nima uchun alohida
Here
guruh
studies show that
bo'lganligini tushundirdi, chunki milliy etnik
causing bodily or mental harm in order to destroy the group, not
alohidligi
deliberately
to'g'risida.
inflicting on the group conditions of life likely to bring about its destruction. Again, much evidence showing such things happen, but insufficient to prove destruction. Turning to imposing conditions intended to prevent birth, the PRC
Ya'nilam
is putting
bu
in place a comprehensive system of measures to
tug'ut
optimize the
to'g'risidagi
population,
Uyg'urlarninki
population in Xinjiang, with a particular focus on the
nopusni
southern
kontrol
region,
qilish to'g'risida
which is a majority Uyghur
qo'lga
population.
tushgan butun materiallar,
To sort
isbotlarni
of
tushundiradi.
rebalance the respective Han and Uyghur populations, increasing the former and reducing the latter.
Ya'ni Xitoy
By overstating the migration of Han
nopusni
population
yuqorilatish,
may
Uyg'urlarni
reverse the
ozlatish
proposed
siyosati.
tendency, as already explained, by reducing the birth rates and
Ya'ni
population
birisi
growth.
tug'ut cheklash orqali Uyg'urlarning
This may
nopusini
even result in a
ozlatishi
reduction in the
maqsad
overall
qilganligi.
population over time. The tools of its policy include sterilization
Hamda
by
buni
removing
maqsadga yetish
widespread
uchun
forced insertion of infected babies,
ayollarni
removal,
majburiy
IUDs, equating to mandatory
tug'ut
sterilization
operatsiya qilishi,
associated with
uzuk
forced
solishi va
abortion.
bolalarni
These
tushirishi
policies
degan
will result
bu
in significantly
siyosatlarninki
fewer births in years to come than
isbotlangani
might
va
otherwise
faktlarning
occur.
to'liqligi to'g'risida buni
The
tushuntiryapti.
population of Uyghurs in future generations will be smaller than it would have been without these policies.
Agar bu siyosatlarni qo'llanmagan
This will
bo'lsa,
result in
Uyg'urlarninki
destruction.
nupusi kelgusida
Rules that the
jiq
genocide
bo'ladi.
convention uses the word destroy. This satisfies a prohibited act.
Endi bu qirg'inchilik siyosatida bir millatninki millatni buzg'unchilik qilish, yo'qotish maqsad qilgan. Ya'ni bo'libmi bu shu Xitoy hukumatiningki Uyg'ur nopusini qisqartish siyosati na asos qilgan taraf orqali tushuntiryapti.
Genocide is forceful transfer of children. Thousands of children, maybe hundreds, removed from the care of their families, sometimes with one or both their parents
Yani
in
birisi
prison.
bolalarni majburiy yo'tkash,
Sometimes the subjects
bu
being lost
kichik
placed in hand-run state institutions, including boarding schools and orphanages.
o'zining
Some
oilasini
parents
ayirib
don't
o'tish,
know where their children are. Or even
o'zining
whether they're allowed
bolalarninki
there.
ota-onalarning
These children
bolalaring
are
qayerligini
in their
bilamagan
institutions in great
azob
conflicts.
uqubat bu
These
jihatlarni
acts
tushuntirib
are a grave
o'tdi.
threat to the integrity of the Uyghur group and could be a means by which the state could effect its destruction of the group.
Bu
overall
albatta bir
prosperity.
millatninki
But insofar as this argument is concerned, the
ig'ir
whole
tahdid
system
bo'lganligi
is
buni qabul qildi, ammo qonun sud kollegiyasininki bu maqsadlik buzg'unchilik harakat qilganligi ekanligi
and indeed the general wisdom
yetarlik
exercised by
darajada
PRC to make
ya'ni
determinations about genocide referred to above is heightened, since anything
taraqqiy
destruction,
qilmadi demakchi.
even articulated as physical and biological, does not have a unique meaning. And it's easy to imagine circumstances where an intention to destroy one means might be associated with an inconsistent crimes against humanity attributable to the PRC is established beyond reasonable doubt by acts of deportation, forcible transfer, imprisonment, severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, other sexual violence, enforced sterilization, persecution, enforced disappearance, and other inhuman acts. As to genocide, it will be clear from the above that all elements of an intended genocide to be accomplished by a conventionalistic act imposing measures to prevent births within the womb are established, subject only to whether the part subjected, part that is subject to the intended destruction would qualify. If the part is sufficiently large, then genocide would be proved. The tribunal recognizes that this may be the first public evidence-based determination of genocide under Article 2D of the Convention, or crimes under similar statutes. Crimes under statutes that are in similar terms. The tribunal would, as I would, prefer not to make such a finding, and to allow findings of genocide to match more closely the likely general public understanding of the word. The tribunal recognizes that a finding of genocide based on control of genocide may even seem to some close to the lawful management by governments of other societies elsewhere. In fact, some minds might be awkward and uncomfortable considerations about worldwide understandable population growth. Between 1945 and 1948, men and women who had had experience of one, and usually two world wars, and wanted to save us from the worst that we could do to ourselves.
Yani bu Uyghur so'tininki
Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention.
insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat Xitoyninki buni rasmiy qabul qilganligi, buningga to'liq isbot borligi to'g'risida tushuncha berdi. Hamda hozir shu qirg'inchilik, ya'ni irqiy qirg'inchilik olib berishdagi sud qonuni jihatdagi asoslarni hozir tushuntirib o'tyapti. Masalan, 1945 yildan 48 yilgacha bo'lgan jarayondagi qonunninki kelib chiqishi to'g'risidagi to'g'risida.
About making findings of this crime on the basis of evidence that links the crime to the very highest political figure of a country. It would seem altogether more appropriate for such things to be dealt with by governments or international organizations. Governments have no courage to do such things. Neither does the United Nations, where a powerful state is involved. And so it falls to this tribunal to make clear, on the basis of findings set out, that the unborn part of the Uyghur ethnicity of Xinjiang, calculated by consideration of the likely numbers of Uyghurs in years to come, that there would have been measured against the likely number of Uyghurs that there would have been had the Uyghurs not been treated in the way that they were by measures to prevent births, constitutes a substantial trial for the purposes of the convention. And accordingly, on the basis of evidence heard in public, the tribunal is satisfied
Şoňa bu yuqorqy bütün bayan qılganlar asasen Uyghur milletininki bu tuğul çekilişi, yani noposunun azaytışı məqsədlik bolğanlığı, muşu siyasətke muşununğa asasen en ahırda.
with no evidence of any mass killing, may be thought to diminish the perceived status of genocide as a crime, and in one way,
Yani sotnunki qo'liga tushgan faktlarga asasen yani to'liq insonlarni öldürüş, yani köp sallık öldürüş bundaq bir ispatның bolmaganlygını. E,
public attention, but sometimes at a cost to other tragedies, less able to attract attention despite being as serious. The suffering of the Uyghurs has attracted public attention by superlative and hyperbolic expressions of concern for reasons that may not be entirely clear. Other suffering that has included large-scale killings of those without religious
yani
affiliation
o
or refuge
Uygurlarnınki
or
bugünkü
Christians
bu
killed in Nigeria or
azap
Yazidi and
okubatlarga
Christians killed by Daesh.
xalqarada
But with less
köplegen
religious
kişilerinki
and related genocide attached to
naiti
their suffering have found it harder
köngül
to
bölgenligi
verify
toğrusida
sympathy or advocacy.
biraz düşendirip
Furthermore,
ötdi.
most of those affected
Mesela
in jail
parlament
lost their
yani
lives,
siyasonlar ve
their lives remained,
mutaxassislerinki
some still improved.
Uyghur meselesiga köngül bölgenligi toğrusida.
Further, in truth, genocide is not necessarily the worst of all possible crimes. Activating a dirty bomb in a city might be no genocide, despite the death and devastation caused. The Twin Towers attack was terrorism, but not genocide. So why should what has been happening to the Uyghurs be taken so seriously? The Genocide Convention was concerned at its creation in 1948 with the survival not of individuals,
Yani nime üçün bu Uygurlarga bolatkan hazırkı Xitayning
religious groups. It looked
cinayetini
forward to how it
irqiy
might prevent
qirg'inchilik
destruction.
mu emasmi deb buni
It looked
baholashni
simulating action in
sot
other countries
öz
with the
üstiga
false
ag'anli
existence
to'g'risida
of
bir
suffering,
yani qayta
even before
tushuncha
the
beryapti
first
nima
act
uchun
of
buning
destruction
muhim bo'lganligi.
may have occurred. That ambition, it might be thought, is as important today as then. Ours is a world of many nations, ethnicities, races, and religions, all of which are entitled to survive, all of which are supported by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, none of which is to be extinguished. Some might say what happens in Xinjiang is merely the encouragement to assimilation of groups, assimilation being something that's happened naturally throughout recorded history, and that the PRC might simply be bringing greater security and borders to the country of a single character by what it's doing. Such thinking might of course be misguided, because the experience of many ethnicities is that they have great power to survive despite attack. But assimilation by encouragement or force would set at naught the value of diversity experienced in everything.
Yani Xitayning siyasetini o'xshamagan kishilarninki o'xshamagan tushunchalarni tushunadi. Balkim ba'zilarninki tushunchasida bu bir millatninki etnik kimligini o'zgartirish bu qandaq cho'ng bir masala emas degandek, lekin bir millatni majburiy o'zgartirish o'ziniki bir jinoyat ekanligini tushuncha berdi.
They have been driven by envy of China's success, by fear of China, and so on.
Ba'zilarniki masalan Xitoy hukumatiga bo'lgan ko'z qarshi, ya'ni Xitoy hukumatininki dunyodagi o'rinni yo'qotish uchun o'zining asli Xitoy hukumatining siyosatini qo'llagan to'g'risidagi kishilarning fikrlari to'g'risida bir tushuncha berdi hozir.
And who can make their voices heard on issues to which this judgment may relate will do so. Much of the material before the tribunal has been for some time in the public domain from other sources, and it could reasonably have been expected that governments, organizations, and businesses interacting with the PRC will have already factored in what was revealed in that material and now in this judgment. And indeed, it's worth noting that the US government has, through its two secretaries of state, as it happens, asserted genocide has been occurring, and that some sanctions have been imposed by the USA, European now be found not to be effective. Maybe the PRC, if confident of its opinion, would not want to hide, as if in shame, behind the reservation. Fourth point. From the PRC's and CCP's points of view, there is no appeal from the judgment of this People's Tribunal or from the opinions elsewhere about these matters adverse to the PRC. They all stand unless corrected. Now, China is one of the oldest civilizations existing today, and yet it faces determination supported by evidence that would show it to be in part of the party of the government, not the people, only the people. These determinations cover a period when the PRC has been establishing itself as the most powerful nation on earth soon.
Yuqorda asasen parlamentlarninki ve Amerika hökümetinin bunu qırğınçılıq dep ataganlığı toğrusida düşençlerini bädi. Xitay hökümetinki ve Xitay halkınınki tarihi qısqaça bu bir medeni milletlik toğrusida düşençe bädi.
And to become a country to envy, emulate, and admire without being in its approach towards the Uyghurs as the judgment reveals as bad as it has been. Many what the tribunal have been dealing with have been unavoidable, unnecessary human tragedy, sad in the extreme for all observers to behold, devastating and worse to have experienced as victim. Could the wonderful, diverse entity of China have expected better of itself? Could we have expected better of China? The PRC is said to want to expand its influence economically and by other means.
Yani Xitay hökümetinininki siyaseti toğrusida özünü aqlaş siyaseti toğrusida düşençe berip atyr.
Submission of its actions to the world's highest courts, the ICJ, the ICC. That would be leadership by example, willingness to expose conduct of state or of individuals to international public review, something the rest of the world's citizens might want, even if something that their governments, especially governments of large and powerful countries, might fear. Before the PRC should reject the idea, given the worldwide concerns about treatment of the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and now this judgment, might it, on behalf of its 1.4 billion citizens, consider what those in other countries who buy T-shirts made of cotton from Xinjiang, computers, and other items all over the PRC, what must they think of a country that fears its own people using their intellects freely? It applies barbaric methods of torture to people as if hoping to change their minds permanently. It squashes 1 million or more of its people together in cells so small they cannot even lie down to rest. It so coarsens its citizens working in detention centers as to allow women citizens to be raped or gang raped, men to be raped.
Ahırda yani Xitay hökümetininki Uygurlarga ve Türk musulmanlarga
Understanding that preserving what in translation
kollanğan siyaseti ve zoravallık toğrusida yana qayta
China leaders and followers
düşendirip çıkıp atydy.
misconduct does anything to preserve the face and dignity? Does it think that those from foreign lands will be unaffected by the truth that has emerged and emerges further in this judgment? Will its leaders and citizens really keep faith as those facts are ever better known? Might its own citizens prefer to see this judgment and other opinions adverse to the PRC subject to international scrutiny? 5, and then I'm nearly done. The tribunal's work, lasting a little over a year and accomplished with pro bono or lightly paid researchers and
Endi
otherwise
Uyghur sotuninki xizmat jarayonini düşendirip atyr.
has been comparatively straightforward. Its work that has been done in
qısqa vaqtning ichida bu oxirgi
enough
qarorni
at
chiqarganlik
possible defense,
to'g'risida.
even without actual government or United Nations government consultation. It is work the product of which may now limit the brutality of crimes against humanity and genocide demonstrated in various forms, but may save lives, may allow the unborn to be born, may save women from having their ability to give life brutally destroyed once needing to be done, as the work done by this tribunal had to be commended. Sixth, final reflection. If rights are truly universal, then they are matched by universal duties, and those duties are personal. Not only is your right as an immediate neighbour your neighbour's duty to uphold, your neighbour's duty, even on the other side, your neighbour's right, even on the other side of the planet, is similarly your duty to uphold, if ever possible. International bodies, nation states, big NGOs deliver some part of the individual's duty. But that doesn't mean that that personal duty to be honoured citizen to citizen wherever possible does not exist. The personal duty can be delivered in part through the ballot box. But elect leaders who often do not respect and support the rights of citizens everywhere. The personal duty includes choices of power and where to deploy influence, how to spend money and time, or where to study and with whom. So if the citizen is left by governments or other bodies that avoid finding and revealing certain truths, the citizen is left uncertain about events near or far away, then the citizen's duty that might be activated is suppressed. That is why, when governments avoid that genocide prevention undertaking, it is appropriate for citizens, as in this tribunal, to do what governments fear to do, no more than to fill a gap in knowledge that could and should have been filled by others. The tribunal has respected the PRC and its people, recognizing significant differences of culture between them, differences in approach of PRC citizens to authoritarian regimes. The tribunal has considered only the clearest breaches of international standards of law, to which the PRC is fully committed, acting with great care to reach its decisions. So much for the tribunal.
Hem de ahırda Uyghur sotununki ammavi bu sutta anlanğan dəlil isbatlağı asasen Xitay hökumətinin Uyğurlarga qartılğan siyaseti, yani bir qismini yo'qotishni maqsad qilgan tug'ilishni aldını balalarning tug'ilishining oldini olish tadbirlarini qo'llanish degan orqali shu qirg'inchilik, irqiy qirg'inchilik jinoyatini qilganligini shaksiz ya'ni shaksiz e'lon qiladi. Ya'ni Xitoy hukumati Uyg'urlarga qarshi irqiy qirg'inchilik ilib bordi deganni qaror qildi. Buningda Sir Jeffrey Nice efendim özününki ko'z, ya'ni shu Uyg'ur sotininki nima uchun bu vazifani ustiga olganligi va xalqaro sud, davlatlik sudlarning bu unaga ko'ngil bo'lmaganligi uchun bu gerçi bu sudning qonuniy yuqur huquqi bo'lmagan darajadami balkim yani azap okubatda turgan şu milletler Uygurlarga okşaş milletlerge bir yoruqluqqa chiqish bir sababi bo'lib qilishini arzu qildiganligini tushundirib o'tdi.
the Uyghur Tribunal has concluded that the government of the People's Republic of China is guilty of committing crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghur people. This is a rare moment of accountability for the families of victims and the survivors of the PRC's regime's cruelty. Over the past year, the Tribunal has amassed by far the most comprehensive body of evidence on the Uyghur crisis in existence. Following a rigorous and impartial process, this People's Tribunal of objective professionals, all instructed fully on applying law, have concluded that the PRC is perpetrating genocide. The Tribunal has worked to the highest criminal standards and has proof beyond reasonable doubt. And we want to put on record our thanks to all of those that came forward and provided testimonies. This emphatic decision must now compel the UK government to take action in accordance with its international legal obligations. Under Article 1 of the UN's Genocide Convention, which the UK and China are signatories to, states have a duty to prevent genocide by all means possible and punish the perpetrators. And this obligation is triggered the moment a state learns that there's a genocide, which the UK has heard today. Our government now has a duty to engage all statecraft, due diligence, risk assessment, all internal and international toolkits available to ensure we are not aiding or abetting the Uyghur genocide. It was noted by Sir Geoffrey that in April, Parliament made history by recognising unanimously that the treatment of Uyghurs in China is genocide. We were joined by parliaments in Canada, Netherlands and the United States. At that time, the government refused to act. Today, everything has changed. Today, the Uyghur Tribunal has declared that a genocide is taking place, and we are demanding that the UK government makes time for debate in both houses to discuss what urgent action they will take next. We urge our government to carry out the review of export controls they promised in January. They must put in place sanctions on the architects of this genocide, including Chen Quango. They must put import controls on the products of Uyghur slave labour, and they must acknowledge in public that the Chinese authorities are committing genocide against the Uyghurs and engage with their legal duties to protect the Uyghur people. 51 years ago, the United Kingdom signed up to the UN Genocide Convention, designed to ensure that atrocities like those that happened during the Second World War could never again take place. Yet, in the 75 years since the Nuremberg trials, the UK has never succeeded in recognising a genocide while it was ongoing. With today's verdict, we have a chance to put that right. Never again should mean just that, never again. And we implore the government to stand up for the Uyghur people and stand by its UN obligations to prohibit the acts of genocide and to hold those responsible to account, and to ensure that we are in no way complicit in this ongoing genocide. I now turn to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
I am here also as a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which contains members here, many of whom myself, Nuz, Lord Alton, and others have all been sanctioned by the Chinese government. We're here as well, and I am also the co-chair of an all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky sanctions. And yesterday, in anticipation of this result, we called on a list of Chinese officials and a business to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky proposals. And this will be another area that we will be wanting to look at following this report. I completely support what my colleague Nuzgani has said, which is we now need the British government, in the light of this report, to look carefully at this report and then come forward to both House of Commons and the House of Lords to have a full debate with the government at the dispatch box explaining what their position will be now with regards to genocide of the Uyghur people. They have failed so far to do that. We now need the government to step up and do that. And all the other issues around the products coming out of Xinjiang now also have to be dealt with in line with what the government previously said they would do but has yet to do. This cannot be trumped. This is the most serious issue that could ever happen in a country to its people. The idea that a country's government would so determine that a particular ethnic group of people were not worthy of living or even living in that country is absolutely clearly genocide when you see what's happened as a result. And so we call upon the British government now to step up, to make those changes, to have that debate, and finally to declare genocide.
I now turn to Lord Alton.
I endorse everything that's been said by Nusrat Ghani and by Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. My own interest in this issue goes back many, many years. I visited Western China, and I am Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Uyghur Group. The evidence that we've heard this morning, as set out by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC and by the Uyghur Tribunal, is truly harrowing. It was shocking to hear about the systematic campaign to obliterate this population, to reduce this population, and to hear this finding of genocide. As Sir Geoffrey made clear, crimes against humanity are proven too in the most appalling cases of torture, rape, the mass movements of people, 1 million and more who are in re-education camps. What are we going to do about this? The Foreign Secretary has herself, Liz Truss has said, this is a genocide. Well, when words like this are used, it shouldn't be for rhetorical effect or for hyperbole. This is in line, as Sir Geoffrey made clear, with the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. Genocide has been found. What are we now going to do about that? One practical thing, of course, will be to make clear that there will be a total diplomatic and ministerial boycott of the Genocide Olympic Games. A second thing will be to stop companies operating in this country who have direct links to genocide in Xinjiang. One example is Hikvision, banned in the United States, but not here, and many of us have been calling for it to be banned here. And there are many other practical actions which can be taken. It is for the government now to come forward with those, and I agree with Sir Ian that there should now be a full-scale debate in both houses following the finding today, so that parliamentarians are able to say to the government, we expect action now to be taken. I'd make one final point, which is that during the Trade Act, I moved an amendment in the House of Lords, which went to the House of Commons, and by a whisker failed to be incorporated in that Act. It would have empowered the High Court of England and Wales to do the job that has fallen on Sir Geoffrey Nice QC and this independent Uyghur Tribunal to do. It should not have been left to them. They have been extraordinary in their diligence. They've been magnificent in the way that they have courageously gone about this work. But it should not have been left to them. It is the duty of governments who say it is a matter for courts to determine whether a genocide has occurred or not, to make sure that such a route is opened. That route is not there at the present time, and that is still the major defect that this government and all governments have to address.
We have with us on the stage Rishan Abbas, Rahima Mahmoud, and Dulkan Issa from the World Uyghur Congress. I think Dulkan will say a few words, and then we'll field some questions from the floor. Dulkan?
Thank you. I, on behalf of also Uyghur community around the world, welcomes with great encouragement the final judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, which announced today that Chinese Communist government atrocity crime against the Uyghurs and the other peoples of Turkestan amount to genocide and the crime against humanity. This is the historical day for the Uyghur people. We can only hope that the world takes meaningful steps to end the genocide, crime against humanity, and the torture, that the perpetrators, Chinese Communist Party, is held responsible for such as atrocity.
If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and tell me which media organisation you're representing. Yes.
DGN. you mentioned the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympic Games. Will you now be seeking a full sporting boycott of the Games as well?
I will let Sir Duncan Smith lead on that. We have been talking about a full diplomatic boycott, but we want to make sure that the term diplomatic is fully understood, don't we, Sir Ian?
Yes, yesterday in answer to a question, Prime Minister's question, the Prime Minister appeared to agree that there would be a full diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. That means, by the way, so that we can define it, means no government minister, no government official, including Foreign Office officials such as ambassadors, etc. That means nobody in an official capacity relevant to government can or should attend. Anyway, interestingly, the Chinese then reacted by saying they never invited them in the first place. So it looks like they've also made us a diplomatic boycotting country. But the main point is, you're asking about sporting boycotts. Now, I take a very simple view with this. I leave it up to individuals. Each sportsman or woman that takes part in the Olympics will have to make that decision for themselves. I've already spoken to the British Olympic Committee, and I said, you should now take a position to condemn what's going on in China, but your individual athletes can make their decision alone. And I hope that they will look at what's going on in China and ask themselves a very simple question: is it worth it? Worth it to endorse, by giving them that publicity moment, to endorse the terrible abuse that's taking place by the Chinese government.
Next question. Yes, please. From which news? So the question, if no one else can hear it, was about Hikvision, about supply chain transparency in procurement. I assume that was the point of your question. Well, the Business Select Committee, which I wrote a paper for on supply chains, asked for a review of which services we were using and whether they were making our infrastructure vulnerable to the Chinese state. But I'll let Lord Alton respond to the Hikvision question.
And I support what Nusrat has just said about supply chain transparency, and indeed I have a private members' bill before the House of Lords at the present time, which seeks to amend the Modern Slavery Act in order to introduce much more coherence in the way that we deal with supply chains. I would like to see kite marks on products telling us, not made in the PRC or made in China, but I would like to see kite marks that can guarantee that nothing within the supply chain can be attributed back to slave labor in Xinjiang. So that's on the first point. The second point, specifically about Hikvision, is I moved an amendment to the Telecommunications Act so that where in another jurisdiction of a Five Eyes country, and I was thinking particularly here of the United States, had banned a company on the grounds of evidence that it had seen of its involvement in the surveillance state in Xinjiang, then we would be required to review their status in the United Kingdom as well. That was not passed, but I still believe it would be the right thing to do. Ministers said that they were with it in spirit. Well, they should now be with it in practice and should be reviewing companies like Hikvision, who are directly linked to the surveillance state, the controls that we've heard about today that have been imposed there, and as you said in your question, are to be found on every high street pretty well in this country as well. Data collection is something we should be very, very concerned about.
We've also been joined on the stage by Baroness Helena Kennedy, and she's also one of our parliamentary colleagues that was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. Sir, what is your question?
The judgment for Uyghur Tribunal is coming up. Now I see such high-profile figures here, which helps with raising awareness. My question is that, are you interested in Uyghur Tribunal? Do you know about it, and will you be there?
I'm sorry, sir. This morning we're fundamentally focused on the Uyghur Tribunal and the announcement made by Sir Geoffrey this morning. If you want to refocus your question, I can return to you.
Okay, my question is that now, I mentioned the Uyghur Tribunal, but the result of this tribunal, that the judgment says that beyond reasonable doubt, the Chinese government is condemned of torture, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, what's the process from here? How are you going to go forward? How is it going to turn into, for example, a government condemnation or even a law or sanctions against China?
So I mentioned a list of things that we've asked our government to do to respond to the UN obligations and to ensure that we're not complicit. Looking at our supply chains, looking at procurement, and calling out the evidence that was stated today by Sir Geoffrey. But I'll let Sir Ian add to that.
Well, actually, I was just looking. Sorry, yeah. I've just been looking at the list for the full sanctioning under Magnitsky, which we held in a debate yesterday. I'm going to just read it out. It's about 3 or 4 people. This is number 1, what the British government could now do, which is to go forward with these individuals and sanction them. The first is Chen Guangguo, which you've already heard about, but he's known as the architect of the appalling genocide that's taking place now in Xinjiang. He was also, by the way, for those who may not know this, the architect of the suppression of the Tibetan peoples and the destruction of their culture and their nature, and the fact that they're going into what is known as labor camps. Can I make a simple point here? We no longer call these labor camps. We call them what they are, concentration camps. It's high time we got this term right, because labor camps gives people a sense that somehow there's something possibly okay about them. These are concentration camps that we learned the hard lesson about during the course of the last war. So some other names that are on that list as well, and I'm just reading them out to you now. The Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, that has to now be on it. It is a paramilitary organization. Pang Jiaru and Sun Jinglong both worked in the Xinjiang area, and they held senior positions and were responsible. And the final name is For Li Yu, as the former party secretary of the Xinjiang Public Security. The British government should now put Magnitsky sanctions on these immediately. It should hold that immediate debate about what to do with regards to declaring a genocide, and the British government should step up and give its opinion clearly, honestly, and openly now.
I know that Dulcan and Rahima have to do another interview. I'm just going to quickly come to Baroness Helena Kennedy to wrap this up for us. Thank you.
Let me start by saying that this was a very distinguished panel led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who is one of the world's really most esteemed lawyers, really experienced in the field that we're talking about here today, and assessing evidence, looking at the standard as to which it must reach in order to be convinced of the seriousness and the gravity of the allegations that he was dealing with his panel. I really want the nation to listen to this. We have a duty under the convention to prevent genocide, not to wait until it's over. And that's why our government has to act. And I want to echo what Ian Duncan Smith has just said as my co-chair of IPAC. We really have to have our government take a stand on this. The evidence is clear. The evidence is absolutely there for anyone to see the gravity of what is being alleged here. And I really urge everybody who is concerned with justice in the world, concerned about the ways in which we do our business with the world, it's really imperative that we call upon our government to act now.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize, I can't take any more questions. Thank you so much.
I think we're all assembled. I'm afraid Ms. Rose had to leave because of other commitments. Otherwise, I think we're all here. Anybody has any questions, please let me know, and I'll see who's able to answer them. Yes.
From France. Did any of you receive any threats or intimidation before this verdict?
No.
Nothing at all? No pressure?
No, I mean, we were sanctioned, but that was all. And I explained only in short form how the sanctions actually had very limited effect. There was one way it had an effect, which was slightly unfortunate, and that is that Council's team was to have had a woman lawyer, a member of it, and unfortunately the sanctions, not on her, but for associated reasons, made that impossible, so that was unfortunate. We lost our two first choice, very senior lawyers who would have done things, no doubt, in their own way. We lost them. That was all. Of course, there have been plenty of ad hominem attacks on us, but we don't even bother to read them. Why should you?
Can I just go over one point that you made during your reading earlier, was that it's the tribunal's conclusion that everyone in the top levels of the Chinese government, including the president, was fully knowledgeable of what was going on and thereby fully sanctioned what was going on.
Why doesn't Mr. Vetch answer that? Because he's as familiar with the material as I am.
Yes, as Sir Geoffrey said in his statement, we had a significant amount of evidence linking by means of policy, speeches, visits to the area by President Xi and other senior officials in both the party and the government. And that was then underwritten and reinforced, if you like, by the leaked papers, commonly known as the Xinjiang papers, where we could make a direct link to policies, strategies, and the implementation of those to the most senior people in the government, including President Xi.
Sir Geoffrey, you mentioned the failings of governments and bodies such as the UN to make such a determination, and thus it's fallen to the tribunal to do so. Why do you think it is that such bodies have neglected in that responsibility?
Maybe my colleagues will have other observations to make, because I get a bit close to this, and you've now heard from the politicians, Ian Duncan Smith in particular. So my perception is that countries don't like governments of countries don't like to be compelled to do things, even by the highest moral or ethical imperative. And it's worth noting that the Genocide Convention was not something that the United Kingdom wanted in 1948. It reluctantly signed up. It didn't ratify it until 1970. Likewise, America didn't sign up until later on in 1970s, and China. And they don't like being told to do, even when there's an absolutely irresistible imperative. And I don't know whether I was on in for all of the time that Mr. Duncan Ian was speaking, but last year and this year, there was an effort by Lord Alton to introduce an amendment to the trade bill that was going through Parliament, which would have said it was improper or wrong. You couldn't make a trade deal with a genocidal country. And the government put an enormous amount of effort and resources into stopping that amendment. And it's distressing to read. And from the point of view of the Uyghurs, for example, not wishing to diminish our abilities, but if that amount of effort by a government department had been put into the work we've done, this result could have been achieved more swiftly. But my friends who come, one of the great advantages of this tribunal is that I have colleagues from all different parts of English society in a way, because they're different disciplines, and maybe some of them would like to answer that. Let's see.
Thank you. I wouldn't claim great expertise in the area of why governments do or don't do things, but there is, obviously, one can look at the record over many years, and actually the record of countries avoiding findings and descriptions of other countries as committers of genocide, precisely because of what Geoffrey was talking about, the obligations under the convention to do something about it. I think that when one is addressing powerful countries in the world, then smaller countries feel reluctant to address it, I suppose, partly because fear of what the consequences will be, and partly because unless it can be coordinated with more powerful nations or through the UN, which at the moment is obviously blocked by the fact that the Security Council has people on it who are not interested in pursuing, oh, it's not even me, that's not interested in pursuing it, means that the UN is actually unable to do anything about it. And so the tribunal became necessary to fill that void and to fulfill a mission of informing people what was going on, what is going on, the broad parameters of which have been well known for some time, at least from going back 5 to 10 years when these policies in Xinjiang were intensified.
Can I go? So Geoffrey, hi, Sylvia from the Associated Press. Several legislatures around the world have declared genocide, and so has the US government. And your ruling is not the first and will add to that body. How confident are you, though, that it will make a difference to Chinese policy and how the British government handles this very thorny question? And I mean, does it? I mean, as an independent body, would the Chinese government take this seriously at all, or brush it aside?
It's a very interesting question. As a matter of detail, it's what, 6 parliaments, but it was actually the United States government itself, because it was the Secretary of State. So there's quite a difference, and the point that was made in the judgment at one stage is it's quite interesting that all these parliaments, 6 of them, have said it, the English parliament said it without opposition. It was a unanimous vote, and the government still do nothing. And the United States is a government that has said it and has still done nothing. So that's a bit of a problem. It seems to me that, well, first of all, we as a tribunal have no idea what effect there will be. We limit ourselves to providing an answer and hoping that use will be made of it. Perhaps I'll come back to that. But experience shows that this sort of process can have effect, so that you can have reports that don't get anywhere technically or formally. The best known one of which is reported at a higher level than ours. That's Justice Kirby's report for the UNH Human Rights Commission on North Korea, which has been stalled in the United Nations. So it's got nowhere, it's done nothing, and you could say nothing's happened. But if you talk to people on the ground, the fact of his statements, which are very powerful in that report, may well have affected the government of North Korea. But North Korea is never going to say as much. So sometimes you'll have effect, or such things will have effect, and you'll simply never know. Then the second way that I suppose these things may have effect is that, yes, they may drive governments to act because they just feel they can no longer live without the answer to the question. I think there's a third way, but I've forgotten what it is. But it looks as though one of my friends wants to give an observation.
I think it's really important to understand.
And Ruminda does as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Ruminda first and then Mr. Bech.
Yeah, thank you. Where our decision, our judgment, our conclusion differs from others is that we've come to this through the evidence. And that evidence is freely available for all the public to see for themselves and gauge for themselves. So it's a kind of sharing event in a way. It's taken ages, 1.5 years, and we needed time and energy to do that. There's a lot of time and energy invested in this. Not everyone has that. So in that sense, this is a unique phenomena, if you can call it that. The second thing is that as Sir Geoffrey said, governments didn't rise up to the task, and therefore it was left to people like us to do it. So it's generated by people and is adding to the people's momentum, which is already out there.
I would like to add to that this body of evidence is there, and in a democracy like ours, I would throw it back to you, the press, and say that you can actually help to disseminate this and really make this evidence base very much available to the public to share it, because not everybody will go to the website and read it, but they will follow your news items, and an evidence-based argument that you can put forward, I think, as journalists, may have a bigger impact than we could possibly imagine. Thank you.
Well, Cockrell, Coda Story. Have you seen evidence that the witnesses who have come forward have been subjected to any kind of transnational repression from the Chinese state? And in light of the judgment today, will the tribunal be supporting the witnesses in any way in the coming months?
Well, that's another interesting question. And really, Mr. Hamid Sabi, who's sitting here, who was counsel to the tribunal, he might like to come and sit at the bench if he's got anything to say, because we operated a system of some separation of functions in order to ensure that there was independence of the evidence gathering or collection process in the tribunal. Mr. Vetch and I tended to walk across from one to the other, but now the position, so far as we know, because we were sometimes shielded from problems, is that there was definitely some intervention with witnesses, and perhaps Mr. Sabi will be able to tell us a bit more about that. That is direct interference. There's also another feature which I don't want to highlight, but I think is worth mentioning. When you find yourself involved with, as we were, of course, an activist group, the World Uyghur Congress, you've obviously got to be cautious about whether they're going to be acting independently and they're not going to be interfering with the witnesses or anything like that. And they were absolutely impeccable. From start to finish, they and all the people working with them were just like an independent process getting evidence for us. But sometimes you find yourself getting, or Mr. Sabi found himself getting closer to other organizations. And one of the sadnesses of the civil society world is that organizations that should be aligned sometimes become competitive amongst themselves, and that can sometimes operate as an impediment to getting at the best evidence. What we had to ensure was that the witnesses coming to us, were as free and as willing to give evidence as possible, and we did so. But that other little problem's a recurring one, and if only all organizations pursuing particular interest groups, let's not focus on the Uyghurs, there are many others, the more they can cooperate and not feel possessive about their evidence, the better. But see what Mr. Sabi's got to say. Where is he? Oh, there you are.
Thank you. The witnesses, of course, were attacked and harassed by the Chinese government in press conferences that the Chinese organized, the Chinese government organized. They brought, we think by force, their relatives to give evidence against them, to denounce them, to call them liars. And they have continued to harass them even when they are outside China. as near as 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to one of the witnesses who refused to testify because of the pressure that the Chinese government had put on her parents. She was so fearful that she didn't come to give evidence, and very important evidence, I must say, against the Chinese government. And they have continued to harass her with different means and putting a lot of pressure. The witnesses who are outside China are always fearful, because if they are in a country that is close to China, there is always a threat, as you heard from the judgment today, that they may be abducted and returned to China. So that remains to be a problem. I hope Chinese government would now have the courage to stand up and say they will not continue with this practice, and the witnesses are protected from further harassment.
We've had a virtual question in from the South China Morning Post. Given that the Chinese authorities refuse to participate in the tribunal, they could attack the finding as one-sided. How does the tribunal account for this?
Was the last part that who can counteract the suggestion that it's one-sided?
Yeah, how do you account for this?
Well, I'm still not sure. Account for the fact they wouldn't take part, or account for the fact that our judgment is not one-sided?
Do you think the tribunal is one-sided because
no. And this is a very interesting and common, and understandably an interesting question. First of all, obviously we had to do everything we could to get China to participate. So we wrote to them at every, or to be precise, Mr. Sabi wrote to them on every opportunity, inviting them to take part, and notified them of all hearings and so on. You have to send it by letter because they have no other way of communicating. They won't let you get in by email or phone. Interesting. So you do that. When they decline to take part, you mustn't hold it against them, as you'll have heard me say twice in the judgment. Then what do? Well, you do what anybody does when a preferred piece of evidence isn't available. You make sure you find the best other evidence to reach whatever conclusion you can. You don't cut corners, and you try and raise issues that might have been raised by the PRC. Now, if you were here during the evidence hearings, there were a number of witnesses for whom the PRC had made public complaints, sometimes just general, and sometimes in detail. We always got them to deal with them. And you heard me say of 2 witnesses, but one fact witness, a really potentially very important fact witness, who we had no reason to disbelieve, but simply because it hadn't been possible for the PRC hadn't chosen to investigate or consider his evidence when they might have done, we decided we shouldn't act on it. So there are many ways in which you can be fair. And you know, if you think about domestic criminal trials, for example, it's often the case that there's no participation or involvement by an involved or concerned party. In murder trials, the victim is very rarely participating, for example, but you nevertheless manage to find out what happened. And often, for other reasons, parties don't take part. So it's an interesting question. You have to be alive to the problem, and you then do everything you can to counteract. It's not a difficulty to deal with the reality. Let's see if anybody else wants to say that. Yes, Dame Parveen.
Thank you very much. No, I entirely agree with you. It's always very difficult if we haven't got a balanced argument from both sides. But I think we did our utmost to make sure that all the evidence we did get was triangulated from several sides in several ways. So I hope we got to the right conclusion. And as Jeffrey said, we also try to think what PRC might have asked from their side and trying to sort of answer that as well within. And I think you would have heard the Sir Jeffrey earlier on when you said that. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I'm Jane Warren from NTD News. So Jeffrey, I noticed that you mentioned about governments avoiding doing things out of fear. So I wondered if you had any examples of evidence that showed what was causing this fear mainly. Was it some external factors, maybe from the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, obviously, fear comes in many forms. And I'm not suggesting that the governments weren't doing it because they feared physical fear for themselves. But the most likely fear that governments experience when confronted with difficult decisions of this kind is what might happen to trade. Sometimes what might happen to important international relationships. What might happen to their voters' support. You can imagine a government, let's not say the United Kingdom government, we don't want to personalize it, but if you can conceive of a government confronted with a genocide convention duty, knowing that there was fairly fierce measures that it could and morally, ethically, legally should take to stop the alleged genocide happening, continuing to happen, to prevent it. Say really serious trade consequences which would be felt by its people, then the government would start fearing loss of its voters' base. Now, that's exactly the sort of thing that can operate on governments, and that raises really big questions. Are we humans, a single family? Do we actually owe a duty to look after ourselves? As by my observations about citizen-to-citizen duty, I suggested maybe we do. Governments don't like that because they are, especially in democracies, determined to be re-elected and to keep their voter base cheerful. So those are among the sorts of fears that I think governments have. And what was particularly striking for Mr. Sabi, Mr. Vetch, and me, because we were all associated with the China Tribunal, the previous tribunal, that looked at forced organ harvesting. Now, at that stage, China was still everybody's best friend. And so there was absolutely nothing that the government would say explicitly favorable to what we were doing. And you could say there must have been a reason for that because the evidence was overwhelming and that they were fearful of something. What's been rather interesting is that through no desire of ours, we suddenly found ourselves at the beginning of this year, or the end of last year, when we'd already started work, there was suddenly a big following wind of support for anti-PRC, pro-Uyghur activity. It didn't affect us. What does it reflect in government? That something that had been stopping them doing something before had changed. A fear, whatever it was, had disappeared. Anybody else? Yep. Yes.
So one aspect of this question, too, goes back to what Geoffrey was saying about the support which the tribunal didn't get from governments despite requests. And the similar question, I think, applies to those governments, including the UK government. Why did it not provide evidence which it had, despite the many requests which we made? Why did the US government not provide evidence to us, despite that express finding of genocide, as Geoffrey said, unexplained, unsupported by any evidence, but just simply a statement that China was committing genocide in Xinjiang? And I think that is just as difficult a question to answer as the reason why people take no action under the Genocide Convention or more general rules on international cooperation for genocide and other crimes, international crimes.
Are we done? There's somebody in the hall. If that's allowed, I don't see why not. We can't hardly be a democracy without allowing someone in the hall to speak.
Does this work? Yeah. Rabia Khan, member of the public. Thank you for today.
and for all of your work. I have seen the report has been published online, and I will be reading it after this session, and looking forward to spending a bit more time pondering the findings. My question to the panel is about Chinese investment into UK universities, and particularly educational institutes. So there's a lot of Chinese investment coming into UK universities for various reasons. In light of today's judgment, what would you say to those universities? Do you think today's judgment should have a bearing on the decisions to accept investment, to accept projects, ties? What influence should it have on relationships?
Thank you. I've got 3 professorial colleagues. One other has not been able to attend today, so they're going to have a view, which I will, of course, let them explain. And if any of them is not able to explain, they may, of course, have their own internal concerns about not answering the question. But the question, and I'm not going to answer the question specifically, although I can see that Professor Kaur is dying to, so I'll let her get in a second. But it is clearly the case that amongst the people who have to make decisions when this kind of information comes up are universities, both because of campuses they set up in other countries and because of the dependence there is in this country on the funding. And they're amongst many institutions that have to consider that. It was lightly touched on in the judgment, but in the previous judgment, you'll see that it was spelled out a little more specifically when it said that all those bodies, including academic institutions, had to decide, to the extent revealed in that judgment, how they should react with a criminal state, to the extent that criminality was shown. Before Professor Kaur speaks, I would simply say that there no doubt can be balanced decisions. It's all very well for us to be completely moral and want everything to be completely easy. You just do this and you never do that. Somebody was asking me about this earlier. You know, maybe governments haven't any choice but to do nothing when a genocide occurs. Maybe, but they should always say to their voters and public, genocide is happening, for example, and the reason we're not doing this is this. It should be completely open. And it may be that universities tussling with these very serious problems should think that whatever their resolution, they must be clear about what they accept has happened. I don't think I can keep Professor Kaur waiting longer.
Yeah, I'll be brief. And I speak from a personal capacity. So there's 2 problems. One is that universities are seriously struggling and underfunded. So that's a national issue. That's due to the national government. And as a result, they are open to other kinds of investments. Many of them are coming from China. And so often they're in this tricky position where they have to think of their livelihood or their sustenance, and at the same time they're aware of various issues around taking on such contracts. And there are a fair number of universities in UK and worldwide who are in these kinds of relationships. Plus there's the Confucius Institute, which one needs to also consider. And I think on this matter, one has to, especially the executives, along with the governments in those countries, have to look very seriously at what they're doing and the consequences, especially when it comes to areas like AI and other areas which might be linked to these chain supplies that we and others have identified. So I think there's a serious issue here of a rigorous self-examination and re-evaluation of what universities are doing and need to do.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say that some of the students we've had from China have been absolutely superb, and I wouldn't wish to stop that interchange of both research and education across countries. I think in view of what Dr. Kaur, Professor Kaur just also said, universities are very underfunded and dependent on a lot of money. But I think, from outside the country, but I think each institution ought to look at this themselves. It is not for us to say where they should go, and also really analyze what is it that they're doing. Do they believe in maybe research and exchange of ideas above humanity? Well, that's up to them. But the important thing, I think, is that we as a world, as a planet, need to go forward. We need to talk to each other. Obviously, in this sort of situation, it's difficult. But I also think that the sins of the government, so this is a personal view, should not be put down to the sins of the people. The people may not actually agree with what the government's doing. Thank you.
Finally, for the triumvirate of professors, Professor Osler.
Thank you. I think I would reiterate the problem of our universities as being severely underfunded. I would also acknowledge how much I've learnt from students and colleagues from around the world. But I think in the end, decisions will be made in universities in one by one, but also according to the pressures that university staff through their unions and students feel about these issues. And I'm pretty convinced that the decisions that university executives will make will not just be influenced by funding streams, but by the concerns of their own staff and the concerns of their students. I think a lot hangs on those bodies through trade unions and student organizations and unions. Thank you.
Right, I suspect that's about it. Is that about it? One more? Sorry?
We probably have time for one more.
Maybe nobody else wants to ask anything. Ah, there's one at the front there. Frankie, down there.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the judgment. My name is Muazzam Beg. I'm a former Guantanamo prisoner of the United States of America and the outreach director of CAGE. The reason I got involved in getting concerned with the case of the Uyghurs is because 22 of them were held without charge or trial with us in Guantanamo, and one of the things they told me was that they were thankful that they were sent to Guantanamo and not to China. But because of the language of the war on terrorism, and something that you alluded to in your judgment, has given China some cover, to what extent do you think it has exploited that language and has been able to get away with the targeting of Muslims in East Turkestan as extremists and terrorists, if that didn't exist? Thank you.
Thank you. The full answer to that is probably best from not us, but from an academic with a larger view of recent history, because although we've done work on evidence presented to us, we don't pretend to academic expertise. We can deal with the question, but I'm going to ask, first of all, Mr. Vetch, if he'd like. No? Anybody else? Mr. Clark? Yes, and then I'll come back to it.
No, I think that the point you make is a very good one. I think that particularly if you go back to the immediate period after 9/11, 20 years or so ago, in that period, I think that China had an ability to sweep its approach to the Uyghur problem under the global war on terrorism, and it did do that. And in fact, it persuaded the US to join in the categorization of a Uyghur group outside Xinjiang as a terrorist group. And that application of that name lasted, I think, until about 2018 or so. I think, as this is, again, just a view, is that I think that reduced that ability to persuade people that their treatment of the Uyghurs was justified as a part of the global war on terrorism has declined, particularly as the treatment of the Uyghurs became more extreme from sort of 2014 onwards. I think people were less willing to accept, and particularly since the evidence of terrorism in a way which perhaps the wider world would understand it was extraordinarily limited, with every element of violence in Xinjiang and and outside being categorized as terrorism. And I think that had an effect over time. But that's just a view. As you say, Geoffrey, I have no academic research to back it up.
Thank you for that. Anybody else on this? And the history is particularly well covered in two of the reports I spoke of. The Aspie report, the Australian report, deals with it quite well, and also to some extent the Holocaust Museum report. Yes, nothing else I can say in particular, but thank you for your contribution. And I think that's probably, thank you. Oh, one more.
Sorry for keeping you. I'm Jennifer Venice from the International Bar Association's Global Insight magazine. And I wondered why you expressed that you'd felt apprehension or concern about delivering a judgment of genocide on the basis of this prohibited act alone, given that it is part of the convention. As you mentioned, it was written in.
Well, it wasn't possible to be satisfied that the law allowed a disconnect between a precise intention and the acts concerned. On the other hand, it was quite clear that if there was, as we found, a precise match between the intention and one of the defined acts, there could be no challenge to that. So as I made clear, without being express, there might have been an inclination on the tribunal or desire to say perhaps one of the others might have qualified. But in the absence of certainty that a mismatch of intention and act, it was probably in every way appropriate to find as we did. To spell that out in just a tiny bit more detail, because these are difficult areas for people who haven't spent a quantity of time thinking about these things. If you consider the determination made about measures to prevent births, the intention is to prevent births, to stop children being born. It's very simple. If you look at the next possible category of act, which is transfer of children, transfer of children, what's the expectation? Well, it's not that they're not going to have children. It may be the hope that they will have children with Han and dilute the ethnicity. It's a totally different specific intention. If you go back to the first iteration of the convention, you'll see that the various categories then proposed had subcategory definitions. That would have made life much easier. We've been left without that. And it is very important that our findings should be completely secure if it is to be of value. I hope that will do as an answer. And on that note, thank you and farewell.